Well, would you look at the time? It's Jockle Podcast 23. We've got way too much content to cover today, but let's open up with a health tip. This is from foodforbreastcancer.com/amp/news/estrogen hyphen in hyphen chicken hyphen in beef hyphen may hyphen b hyphen contributing hyphen to hyphen hormone hyphen dependent hyphen cancers. So follow along. We've got some may find the study results surprising with respect to chicken, since currently there are no hormones approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration for poultry. So the USDA has determined it is not safe to use hormones in chicken and then have people consume that. That's not all right. That's not okay. However, estrogen may be introduced in the form of soy protein and animal protein meal in chicken feed and possibly other sources. So this is what the chickens are eating. They're eating soy, and they're also eating animal protein meal. So chickens are supposed to eat insects, they're supposed to eat vegetation, but they're eating soy and they're eating animal protein meal. Now, what is this animal protein meal? It could be, I don't know, it could be anything. It could be salmon, it could be beef, it's whatever's cheapest. So whatever's left over. So, okay, well, we're going to cut up this cow, and we're going to sell the hind legs and the butt and everything to the human market, but then all the organs and whatever, that stuff people don't want to eat, we're going to chop that up, make that into chicken feed. Which, if you think about it, the organs are the places that harbor oftentimes the highest concentrations of, insert the blank here. It could be poisons, it could be anything. If we're talking about antidepressants in the system, if we're talking about estrogens, if we're talking about BPA, if we're talking about any kind of toxins, lead, mercury, whatever, those things are not, the highest concentration is not in the muscle, it's in the internal organs, things like the liver. So when you chop up a cow liver or whatever, the leftover liver from a pig or something, and you feed that to chicken, the chicken is eating a highly concentrated form of whatever is in that animal tissue. Again, it could be mercury, it could be BPA, it could be lead, it could be estrogens. And the problem is that you have cows that their main source of food is soy. It's estrogen. That estrogen then becomes concentrated in the internal organs. Those internal organs are then chopped up and fed to chickens in addition to soy feed. It's like a mixture. Like they'll take, they'll chop up a cow liver or a pig liver, then they'll take some soy and they'll mix it all together and feed that to the chickens. And they do this to other animals as well. It's not just chickens, they'll do it with other animals. But the problem is you've already got that chopped up liver has so much soy concentrate, you add that to direct soy concentrate, the literal soy, and all that estrogen is very concentrated goes into your chicken. So based on the available evidence, breast cancer patients, survivors, and those at a high risk should consider avoiding beef and pork, limiting their poultry consumption to organically grown birds, preferably raised without soy-based feed and in humane conditions. So I guess the lesson of today is that you should eat grass-fed beef. Grass-fed beef. The problem with the grass is they're going to spray the grass with pesticides. They're going to go up in an airplane and they're going to spray the grass. That's oftentimes what happens. Or they might not spray it, but the farmers next door, because farmland, often you've got farm next to farm next to farm. One farm might use pesticides. The rain comes. That rainwater then washes the pesticide along the surface of the water and throughout the groundwater across neighboring fields. In addition, you've got, let's say you have a farm, they use pesticide. That pesticide evaporates and it's carried into the water vapor in the air, and then it floats with wind currents and settles in other surrounding farms. So if you have a farm and they say, we've got grass-fed beef, well, what happened to that grass? Has that grass been affected by acid rain? Has that grass been affected by pesticides in the air and the water vapor? Has that grass been affected by direct pesticide use? And those pesticides are going to affect they're going to be a teratogen, so they're going to cause birth defects. They're going to be carcinogens, so they're going to cause cancers. They're going to have all sorts of harmful effects in terms of your hormonal levels, in terms of estrogens, xenoestrogens. They're going to change your epigenetics. They're going to change your psychology. They're going to change your behavior. They're going to change everything about you. And you can say, oh, well, it's just a little, the federal government has set a tolerance. We can use this much. We can use that much. And so they've set a tolerance. And so it's fine. Well, what happened with the BPA oil spill, you have to remember back under Obama, what happened is BP, British Petroleum, they had an exception because the law said you could not drill like British Petroleum was doing. British Petroleum was in the Gulf of Mexico. They were drilling in a way that was technically illegal, but the Obama administration, the EPA, gave them an exception because they're rich and they can pay Washington, D.C. to override the legislation. Every time we write an environmental law, all that happens is the big corporations write a check to the government to get an exception. So effectively, regulation does much less than we would want it to do, and in some cases, all it does is it inhibits small growers or small corporations from operating on local levels and gives all power to the major corporations. And the big thing is a bunch of smoke and mirrors, and it's terrible. But the same thing that happened with British Petroleum is happening with all these other people, where they're saying, oh, well, there's some legal limit, but then there's cases where exceptions are given. And just as British Petroleum didn't intend to have an oil spill, well, sometimes people spill pesticides. That you have a huge barrel, gallon full of pesticides. Sometimes there's a pesticide spill. Is that reported? Is it not reported? We don't know. What happens here? So we know all the time the bigger the food operation is, the more chance for error and the greater chance there is to overlook problems. When you have millions and millions of pounds of food being processed per day, as opposed to you got a little farm in your backyard, you got a farm down the street, whatever, and you've got a few animals or you have some crops or whatever, you can see what's going on with that food, or you can drive down to the farm. It's localized. You know what's going on, as opposed to these huge Monsanto mega farms where you have no clue what's going on. You have no clue if the regulations are being enforced. You don't know if exceptions are being given. And the tolerances that are established, we can't trust the federal government to be establishing valid tolerances, because even if the federal government had our best interests at heart, which of course we don't believe, but if they did, even then, how are they testing? What they're doing is they're testing on rats and mice and other animals which have very short lifespans, and they're saying, is this a carcinogen? Is this a teratogen? Is this? Is this that? They're looking at, okay, we have a mouse, and over the next few weeks we're going to introduce this pesticide into the mouse food, or we're going to introduce it into the air supply of the mouse that's living in this little container, and we're going to observe what happens. Do the mice have birth defects? Does their behavior change? Do they die? But that's a very short span of introduction. What we're not testing for is, okay, let's say 10 parts per million is the tolerance. I'm just making up a number here, but some extremely small. For every billion particles, only a couple of particles are this pesticide. Okay, well, in that situation, yes, I'm only getting 10 parts per million per consumption. So the cow is eating the grass, it goes into the cow. We know as how the food pyramid works. Not the food pyramid you're thinking of with the grains on the bottom, but in terms of the way that the cycling works of the grass is sprayed with pesticide, the cow then eats, pounds and pounds of grass, absorbs that pesticide. The pesticide stays in the cow's body. It's not expunged from the body. And so it stays in the body, and then we eat the meat, which is basically a concentrated form of pesticide. And maybe instead of 10 parts per million, now it's 100 parts per million. Still a very small amount, right? Still harmless in a single dose. However, we're eating, maybe a pound of meat a day or a pound of meat a week or whatever over the course of 52 weeks of the year, over the course of decades and decades and decades. And after 50 years... If you've been eating meat since you were a young child, and then you're a 50-year-old man and you decide you're going to have children, well, what happens? You have 50 years of pesticide-sprayed grass, which is then fed to hormone-injected cows, which is then fed to you, and at the individual single-dose level, 100 parts per million, that's fine. That's totally safe for a single consumption. Nothing bad's going to happen to you from eating beef one time in your life, even if it's injected with hormones, even if it has pesticides. But you do that on a daily basis or a weekly basis, and you do that over years and decades, and all of a sudden, 50 years later, you decide to have kids. Well, don't be surprised if your kids are mentally screwed up. Don't be surprised if they have mental problems, whether it's low IQ or you have a young boy who decides he wants to be a woman, or you have a young woman who decides she wants to be a man, or you have someone who's extremely depressed, extremely anxious. Remember, the brain is a very sensitive hormone, and we know the effects of these chemicals in large doses. It's very hard to study. Remember the tobacco industry. Nazi Germany was the first state in the world to say, look, tobacco is not safe, nicotine's not safe, people shouldn't really be doing this. Still, the German army was still, giving cigarettes to people, and that still happened. But the German government was still one of the first governments to say, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea back in the 1930s, 1940s. How long did it take us for the United States government to finally admit, yes, we were getting all these GIs hooked on tobacco? Turns out it was really dangerous. It really was not healthy at all. So we have to question all these pesticides that they say are safe in a single dose. Well, sure, they're safe in a single dose, but the pesticides accumulates in the body. So we have multiple chemical problems, the pesticides, the BPA, the estrogens, xenoestrogens, the soy. Things that, if we're going to be better safe than sorry, we should outright ban them. But we're not banning them. We're saying it's tolerated in a certain level. And then, China doesn't have the same regulations as us, so we're buying all this plastic crap. You have people who buy a new toy for their kids every week, or you go to McDonald's, you get the Happy Meal, and you get a toy every week. And so the child is being introduced, now there's 1,000 little plastic toys around the home, and all those plastic toys are developed in China where they don't have the same regulations as they do here. And who knows, bismuth, whatever kind of heavy metals are in those toys that the kids are chewing on, touching. So never, 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 ever allow your children to be around plastic toys. Plastic toys should be as far away from children as possible. Anyone who buys plastic toys for the children, they're ignorant, they're uninformed, they don't know what's going on. And frankly, it's stupid. Kids like cardboard boxes. Kids like, give a kid, a hammer. And say, go, hammer some trees outside or something like that. And maybe the kid's going to swing. The worst thing is they can poke their eye out or whatever. But the kid might, stomp on their finger or whatever. People get injured. In fact, it's better to get injured when you're young in a lot of cases, and to realize to be careful and that carry that sense of carefulness with you for the rest of your life than to be sheltered your whole life. And then you're going to be stupid when you're older and you're not going to understand how the world works. Psychologically, children are meant to get scrapes and cuts and bruises and bumps. They're meant to explore the world and understand. That's like our brain chemistry and our DNA is set up in such a way that we are supposed to interact with an environment that not only helps us but also hurts us. And that gives us a full picture of the world. And I think that it affects people's philosophies. If you're sheltered from a young age, I think you sort of develop very deviant philosophies about the way the world really works. So I don't know, I think that's all on the health portion today, but we do have a lot of good things going on. Like 4 minutes before I started this video, the book club came out with James Mason's Siege, came out with a nice book review. A lot of people, Arvel put out a video, I think last night. I haven't gotten around to watching that. We've got Petey, what's his name? Pretty? He's like a South American. I think he's from Brazil or Argentina. Pretty Pablo? Petey Pablo. Why do you have an R? Why is it not Petey Pablo? That makes more sense. So he sends me a video. It's called The Jews and the Survival of the System Anti-Semitism Podcast. It's by a channel called Connected Wisdom. I believe Connected Wisdom is run by a Jewish gentleman. I might be wrong here. He might not be Jewish, but he has a video called Peace in Israel 2 years ago. He has Jew Fact, Verse Fiction, 4 things he thought about the Jews that are wrong. He has Connected Wisdom's Mishalanu. So yeah, Mishalanu sounds like a Jewish name. Proof that there is a real chance for peace between Jews and Arabs inspiring. The bright center. So it looks like, if your name is Igor and you're talking about the bright center, I'm guessing that this guy is Jewish. And the video here, or the video series, Jews and the Survival of the System. But I think it's very interesting because I did make a video on the position of Jews, or half of the video basically of the last podcast was dedicated to the position of Jews in the conservative movement. And I pointed that out in a way that could be considered critical, but really what I wanted to point out there is that I apparently have at least one viewer here who he's giving me a discussion between Ben Shapiro and, I don't know if you remember the name of the atheist, Sam Harris. So two Jews in a room talking about their different opinion. And I was saying, isn't this odd? Like, don't you understand the exceptionalism of this conversation? And the fact that this is hosted on a channel called The Conservative Report, and there's an American flag. So we need to understand the radical exceptionalism of the Jewish people. If we don't understand the radical exceptionalism of the Jewish people, and that includes everybody, black, white, yellow, in between, no one is going to be able to survive the 21st century who does not understand the exceptional success of the Jewish people. And this is why I have some faith in the Chinese government and the Chinese people and Chinese culture, because they recognize the exceptionalism of the Jewish people. And if you go to China, you can find all kinds of various books entitled essentially How to Copy the Jews, or How to Be Like a Jew, or How to Make Money Like a Jew. And these aren't anti-Semitic books. These aren't books that are meant to be insulting to Jewish people or to degrade Jewish people. But they're saying, look, the Jewish people are really exceptional. If we as Chinese people also want to be successful, we have to emulate the Jewish people. We have to learn from them. And this is the same attitude that I think propelled Japan onto the world stage, where they said, look, obviously we're Japanese, we want to maintain our culture, our traditions, who we are, but we're not going to survive the 20th century if we don't westernize, if we don't modernize. And so essentially I look at this, the strategy in the 19th or 20th century was to look at white people and say, how can we be white? That was the strategy of people like the Japanese. That's what it meant to modernize. It meant to become more white. And so when Russia had to modernize, it had to look toward Western Europe, toward the whiter countries, relatively speaking, to talk about R1A, R1B as kind of the core of white civilization or whatever. I'm trying to wake people up to this reality because I think that this connected wisdom guy, Jews and the Survivalist System, I haven't watched the thing, but the Preeti Pablo summary was that essentially Jews are, how did he say it? The nodes? Or no, he said Jews are the hubs, and everyone else, they are the nodes. Jews are hubs and Gentiles are nodes in a natural system. It's basically saying the theory that Jews just fill a role in society that needed someone, and if it wasn't the Jews, it'd be some other group. The system we have evolved naturally. He uses cybernetics or systems theory to explain it. Not complicated, pretty simple. And I think we do need to understand, and when I started to watch this video, the Jew and the Survival of the System, he said, look, in the past, because of the limiting nature of information, the fact that you couldn't transmit information very quickly, it was expensive to transmit, you had to use books, you had to use telegrams, whatever, it was difficult to transmit information. There were a lot of gatekeepers. Even when you had the age of television, there were a lot of gatekeepers on how information is spread, how it flows. But today we live in an age where the technology is such that it's extremely difficult to halt or hinder the spread and flow of information. And so if we want a stable, anti-fragile system, we need a system that can sustain its own narratives even while being criticized. And that's sort of the nature of a capitalist system, right? A capitalist system is that which is evolutionary, scientific, empirical. It's able to undermine itself. It's able to criticize itself. It's able to reformulate itself. That's very important. If we can't do that, then the system cannot survive because of technology. Either we're going to have to destroy our technology, either we're going to have to change the technological landscape. We're going to have to limit people's access to technology. We're going to have to ban the internet. Or the system is going to have to reform itself to be a system which is open to criticism and a system that's open to free speech. So when I say, like, look, people need to be aware of the exceptional nature of the Jewish people. People need to be aware that Mormons are disproportionate amount of people in the CIA, FBI. People need to be aware that for a long time white Anglo-Saxon Protestants tended to be dominant, and we can still see areas in which they're dominant beyond what perhaps we would expect of them. So we can look at different groups. We can look at the Chinese in Malaysia. We can look at these dominant minorities, and we have to understand them, because if you don't understand them, you're not going to survive. You're not going to survive if you don't understand what's going on here. So that's the first level of understanding that people need. You need to understand that there are minorities which are exceptional, and you can emulate them, and you can become a successful minority yourself, or you can be part of the ignorant majority that is very quickly being done away with. It's being done away with through racial confusion. It's being done away with through gender confusion. It's being done away with through identity confusion. It's being done away with through dysgenics. It's being done away with through xenoestrogens and the androgenization of the population. It's being done away with through bread and circuses and hedonism, and they call it ethical hedonism, or the ethical slut. This concept that morality is all about seeking out distractions. And so they've basically given the hamster wheel to people, the hamster wheel of hedonism, and they're just circling around on this. And I can't stop the majority of people from hopping on the hamster wheel. And I don't have any authority or power to pull people off the hamster wheel. And I just walk around and I see people who are dedicated to living out their lives as hedonistically as possible and ignoring anything that's uncomfortable. And I can't force anyone off that hamster wheel. But what I can say is that if you're curious and you're interested in the truth, and you're interested in survival, then what I can do is I can try to open people's eyes who don't understand what's going on, who don't understand how the world works. The world is not run by majorities. The world is run by minorities. And Toynbee, in his Clash of Civilizations, in a sense, you read the general thesis, Western civilization is one civilization, Islamic civilization is another, they're clashing with each other. But the lesser-known thesis of Toynbee is that dominant minorities, or he calls them creative minorities control history. And they're the only people that matter, and everyone else is irrelevant. For people who are not woke to this fact, I'm trying to wake people up to that, so then we can get past the point where we're hating on the Jews because they're disproportionate. I want to point out that fact so people can realize it, but I'm not introducing it in a way that I want to increase anti-Semitism. I'm introducing it in a way of like, hey, this is how a people become successful, and this is the only way to move forward. And if you want to move forward, you have to understand how successful people succeed, and you have to follow in their footsteps or adapt their strategies to fit your particularities, your identity, whatever. And I did want to talk a little bit about, to reiterate, because I've mentioned it before, but I wanted to talk about Nietzsche and Kalergi, and the other figures being Schopenhauer and Evola. So I keep seeing these Nietzsche posters, and it's almost the opposite for me of the relationship with Trump, where I don't really care for Trump. I'm not like loyal to Trump, despite the fact that I'll probably vote for him because he's the free speech candidate. But I'm not loyal to Trump. But when people insult Trump supporters, I say relative to what? Relative to Democrat supporters? Well, Trump supporters on that, I'd much rather live in a neighborhood of Trump supporters than a neighborhood of Democrat supporters. So, that it seems to me to be completely disingenuous to attack Trump supporters as being dumb and ignorant and violent when it's like, well, who's the opposition? The opposition to me seems even more dumb and ignorant and violent than the Trump supporters. So to me, it always seems to be as it seems to be complicated, arrogant, over-intellectualizing mental gymnastics being done to attack Trump supporters. It's almost like when you have, I don't know, you have a guy who punches you in the face as a bully and another guy who, like, breathes heavily. And you say, oh, these heavy breathers, they're such bullies, they're terrible people, they're violent, they violate the non-aggression principle by breathing on me. It's like, well, what about the guy who punches you in your face? Oh, well, he's a victim of systematic oppression and violence and racism and whatever. So, to me, it seems very disingenuous to attack Trump supporters. I'm always suspicious of people who attack Trump supporters without then attacking the other side. I mean, fine, attack Trump supporters. Obviously, Trump supporters at this point are following a guy, people who really support him and believe he's a good guy or whatever, and don't just support him pragmatically or cynically as I do. But if they support him wholeheartedly, you've got some problems. You're ignorant on a number of issues. You don't really understand what's going on. So we can criticize Trump supporters, but to do that in the absence of criticizing the other side seems to me you're totally divorcing the issue of its context. Now, I have the opposite problem with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche in himself brings up some very important points about the Jews. And Nietzsche was one of the first people to say that the Jews are a spiritual elite, and they're probably, and he put it in a positive philo-Semitic perspective, where he said the Jews probably should rule over Europe, and they will rule over Europe because they are the spiritual elite who's sort of destined and deserves to rule over Europe. Now, people hear this and they go through the mental gymnastics to say, oh no, Nietzsche was an anti-Semite and it was all ironic, and he attacked Christianity as being a tool of Jewish subversion. No, he glorified Christianity as a tool of Jewish subversion. And he said that the Jews are a mighty and a proud people who have been able to attack, European civilization in this way, and we should admire them or respect them as having a master morality and creating this slave morality of Christianity to attack European peoples. Now, I don't agree with that. I understand the argument. I don't agree with it. But that was his perspective. And so to call Nietzsche an anti-Semite, people do those gymnastics because, he's pointing out that Christianity is a tool of the Jews. Therefore, he must be anti-Semitic. No, he wasn't anti-Semitic because he didn't believe it was wrong to fight your enemies. So when he in his perspective, he saw the Jews abusing European people. He didn't see that as an evil thing. He viewed that as an aristocratic tactic of warfare to invent Christianity. So yeah, to call him anti-Semitic, I think, is really misguided. And I think when we talk about Kalergi and the Kalergi plan, this is where I have disagreements, huge disagreements with white nationalists, the alt-right. And why I posted this video, I posted this little compilation, and people took it as this guy was fibbing. He was faking it. Now, I can never know what's in someone's heart, but I took him to be honest. I took him to be honest because I really think that the alt-right is not it's not this rational, airtight argument. And one of the problems is Kalergi. They bring up Kalergi. Oh, he was an architect of evil, and Kalergi was he was trying to destroy the white race. And it's like, okay, well, what about Nietzsche? Because Kalergi is really just borrowing his ideas from Nietzsche. And the other one that they worship is Evola, or Evola. They talk about Evola as being this amazing guy. Pan-Europa and Fascism, Colloquium with Count Coudenhove Kalergi, 1933. In 1933, Kalergi expressed his full support for Italian fascism and suggests that federal Europe could be established on the fascist model. Evola asked Kalergi if his pacifism was anti-virile and rejected all war or rejected European conflict. Evola paraphrases, he reminds us how often he has invoked internal European peace only because it is childish to persist in reciprocally paralyzing the economic and military forces of the European states because a European defense unity is necessary in face of the three greatest anti-European powers, Russia, Asia, and America. Kalergi praised the fascist regime for seeking to emancipate politics from economics. And we can read that he praised Mussolini specifically. This feeling for the right moment to join to a latent sense of equilibrium is one of the most outstanding gifts of Mussolini's genius. Kalergi said, "It is my firm conviction concerning fascism's supranational mission that has brought me to Rome, and I sincerely hope that the new Italy will remain faithful to the great tradition, working with every means at its disposal for this European idea, which had already been formulated by Dante, actually spiritualized by the Church of Rome, or actualized spiritually by the Church of Rome, and realized militarily by the Italian Napoleon, and finally renewed in a more modern way by the Mazzinian myth," and he's referring there to Giuseppe Mazzini, the Mazzinian myth of the new Europe. Kalergi met several times with Mussolini between 1933 and 1936. Was Kalergi a fascist? Now, later on, he would go on and he would say, "No, I'm for democracy and I oppose fascism." What he wrote in 1933, "The fascistic opponents of pan-Europe have often tried to identify the pan-European movement with the democratic ideology. This attempt, however, is destined to fail, if only for the reason that my philosophical ideas are not democratic but always aristocratic." This is, again, I don't like Nietzsche lovers. Nietzsche is actually interesting in himself, but people who constantly praise Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is the only philosopher they can name, and he's the end-all be-all of philosophy, I always think of, this is probably a shallow person who doesn't understand Nietzsche. The more people seem to praise Nietzsche, the more I seem to think less of them, and the more they seem to say stupid things. Now let's see if I can unfreeze. Okay, did we unfreeze everything? No, it's still not unfrozen. I can't even pause the video. That's how frozen we are right now. Wow, this is terrible. Okay, did we unfreeze it? No, we still can't click on anything. Alright, so the computer's just frozen. Maybe we're going to figure out how to unfreeze it somehow. I hope I do, because otherwise this video will never end. This is going to be the beginning of the 24-hour live stream of the Jockle podcast, if I can't figure out how to unfreeze the computer. Okay, well, anyway, trying to continue on. Oh, finally. Alright, that was a terrible technical difficulty. But yeah, people who criticize Kalergi out of one side of their mouth and praise Mussolini and fascism out of another side of their mouth, again, seem to be very historically illiterate. They've read memes on 4chan. That's the extent of their historical literacy. They don't understand the ideology of Kalergi. They don't understand his aristocratic position. They don't understand Nietzsche's aristocratic position. And so people, these three figures, Nietzsche, Kalergi, and Evola, are set up in the alt-right as, well, Nietzsche and Evola were Nazis, because that's what sometimes leftists, they say, oh, well, Nietzsche, the Ubermensch, that's Nazism, and Evola was a Nazi, and Kalergi, well, Kalergi, he's connected to the EU, therefore he must be this anti-racist who hates white people and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, you pick some selective quote where he says, well, in the future, probably a lot more people are going to be mixed race. That's basically what Kalergi was saying. And people say, oh, well, you know, that meant he hated white people, and he looked at his dad, who was white, and he hated his dad. No, he borrowed, it's actually a fascinating family, because his father was an anti-Semite who, in trying to prove how the Jews were evil, his father actually came to the conclusion that the Jews were really, there was a dialectic between ancient Judaism, which was evil, and the Jews as taboo breakers, as a positive force for tolerance. He viewed that the spirit of intolerance comes from the monotheism of the Jews, but now that the Jews have become a modern force for tolerance, that they're actually a positive force in society. And his son, that was Heinrich Kalergi, his son Richard looked to his father's ideas and further developed those ideas and further explored them. So it's actually a very interesting dynamic between father and son, where the son really carries on the philosophy of the father, which you don't see a whole lot of in intellectual history. Like, who is Evolá's son? Who is Schopenhauer's son? Who is Nietzsche's son? Not a lot of these philosophers had sons who carried on the philosophy. The Kalergi family is sort of unique in this respect, in that you had a father and a son who were both very impactful, both very insightful. They had something new to say, something interesting to say. And the fourth guy I want to bring up here to really bring things back from Nietzsche and Kalergi and Evola and Mussolini and Hitler and all these people, I want to sort of bring things back to the originator, who all of these people are indebted to, but no one wants to talk about, is Schopenhauer. Nietzsche took everything from Schopenhauer. Hitler, his favorite philosopher, was not Nietzsche. When he ran around World War I, when he was enlisted, he didn't carry around Nietzsche's books. He carried around Schopenhauer's books. Okay? All of these people, whether we're talking about, and of course, Evola and Kalergi owe a debt to Nietzsche in their conception of the aristocratic. Nietzsche was an aristocratic philosopher, but where did he get his philosophy from? Ultimately, it's derived from an inversion of Schopenhauer. And so Schopenhauer, what I'm saying here is that Schopenhauer unveils the nature and the spirit of reality as being derived from the will. Now, Schopenhauer has a negative pessimistic perspective. He has sort of an antinatalist perspective, where he says life is really somewhat cruel and miserable and painful, and it's full of suffering, which is the same conclusion the Buddha comes to. And the Buddha also, you have to remember, the Buddha was sort of an aristocrat. He was actually derived from the warrior aristocratic class, and he came to this conclusion, wow, life is actually full of suffering. We need to detach from life, and we sort of need to become antinatalists. And that's the path that Schopenhauer, he said, well, that's probably the best spiritual path. He identified the priestly path. But out of that, Nietzsche comes along, he inverts it, and he says, yeah, it's true what Schopenhauer says. Schopenhauer has unveiled the mask, he's taken away the shroud, and he's allowed us to see reality for what it is. It's this constant striving toward the will, which is the root of all suffering. And Nietzsche said that, that's where Schopenhauer stops. That's where he ends. He unveils the nature of reality, he calls it evil, and he says we should go live like Jesus or the Buddha. We should detach ourselves from this evil system. That's kind of a Gnostic perspective. But Nietzsche said, no, we have to overcome this system. We have to become a part of this system. We have to become who we are. This process of self-overcoming, we have to overcome our pain. We have to identify pride with pain. We have to take pride in our pain. We have to become part of the system. We have to be successful in this system. We understand through Schopenhauer what reality really is, and now we need to strive to identify ourselves with that reality and to align ourselves with the God of nature, to align ourselves with reality as it appears. So Schopenhauer has, he sort of took away a lot of the Christian conception that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Schopenhauer said, no, we don't live in the best of all possible worlds. In a sense, we live in the worst of all possible worlds. And reality inherently, because of this principle of the will, everything is sort of the worst of all possible worlds, and there's no way out of this materially. The only way out of it is rejecting the will. That's the best thing we can do. Maybe we're going to fail, but that's the best thing we can do. And Nietzsche says, no, we embrace the will, we identify with the will, we understand the will as the governing spirit behind the universe, and we try to align ourselves with it and become as successful as possible. And that's why Nietzsche praised the Jews. And that's why Schopenhauer was never really a friend of the Jews. Schopenhauer, you're never really going to find Schopenhauer praising the Jews. He thought that the best thing to do with the Jews would be to have arranged marriages between Jews and Gentiles, so that there would be no pure Jewish race left on the planet, and the Jews would be too mixed up for anyone to tell who was a Jew, who wasn't a Jew, and then we wouldn't have any Jews anymore. That was Schopenhauer's solution to the Jewish question. Nietzsche didn't view things that way. Kalergi didn't view things that way. This is stuff that it's a little bit paradoxical. It's something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. There isn't, the idea that the Jews are the enemy. And therefore, we have to do the opposite of whatever they do. So, if the Jews are monotheistic, we should be polytheistic pagans. If the Jews are weak physically, and the Jews historically have not maintained their own military force, then we should be as militant as possible. If the Jews say that terrorism is bad, then we have to say that terrorism is good. If the Jews do this, we have to do that. So that, to me, like, obviously that's a very simplistic way to live your life, and that's really how some people live their life, is to become as anti-Jewish as possible. So they identify these people as the enemy. On the other hand, you have people who say we shouldn't even talk about differences between people. We should never talk about Jews as a special kind of a people, because that inevitably leads toward anti-Semitism. And what I'm saying is that, if our system of power is governed and it's ruled and regulated according to the avoidance of facts and the avoidance of truth, then due to the technology of the internet, there's sort of going to be a critical mass that's hit, where if you maintain your system on lies and deceptions and ignorance, that really can't stand up to the test of the technological a gift of freedom of speech that the internet has given us. So the freedom of information is something that the technology of the internet has given us, and it's very difficult. Once that technology, that Pandora's box, has been opened, it's very hard to put the freedom back in the box, so to speak. So what I'm saying is that if we have a system, it needs to be a system where it can tolerate, and it can adjust to, and it can evolve according to pressures from criticism, from skepticism, from freedom of speech. It has to be evolutionary, it has to be adaptive, such that when people bring up obvious facts, it is able to address those facts, it's able to deal with those facts. And if its only response is, no, we just have to be colorblind, or we can never talk about group differences. If you talk about group differences, then you must be a hater, you must want to hurt people. And if that's the straw man, then that's a very weak straw man, and eventually there's going to be a straw that breaks the camel's back here, and the whole thing's going to come falling down. Eventually, that's what you're setting yourself up for. So what I'm saying is, let's preempt that. Let's talk about things openly, not in this hateful dialectic of setting up a scapegoat, being Jews, and just doing the opposite of whatever they do, but taking really a Japanese position, where the Japanese said, okay, we are who we are, we don't want to kill ourselves, we don't want to commit suicide. That wasn't the point of modernization. It wasn't to destroy the Japanese people, but it was to say that the Japanese people, just like every other people on earth, if they want to survive, they have to take this Nietzschean attitude of, okay, we understand that the West is the best at this point in time. How do we adapt and evolve and change ourselves, maintaining our own tradition, maintaining our lineage, maintaining our respect for our ancestors and whatever, but how do we, at the same time while having a positive Japanese identity, how do we modernize and change ourselves? Maybe we start wearing business suits, Western business suits. Maybe we start adapting industrialization, modernization, and technology. Maybe we put away the samurai sword and we start picking up tanks and guns and bombs as a method of warfare. And those changes allowed the Japanese to be successful. And again, the Jewish people, if you look at the Torah, according to the account of the Torah, the Jews, their main strategy to survive as a people, for a time, in between the time of, the time of Moses, essentially, wandering the desert, and then the time when, I suppose, the state of Israel or the Roman Jewish wars come, and Israel has no chance. But there's a time between, and depending on your chronology, it could be hundreds or 1,000 years or whatever. There's a period where there's some form of nation state, or it could be Judah, there can be Israel, there can be several nation states, but there is at least one Jewish nation state in the land of Palestine, which asserts itself, which protects itself, and which promotes itself and fights its enemies on the basis that it is a nation state with a military. And that was the Jewish strategy for a long time. Now, eventually, when the Greeks come in, the Maccabees oppose them. And then when the Romans come in, there's the Roman-Jewish wars. But eventually, that strategy becomes untenable, and the Jewish people had to change from being a warrior people, from being a people who were a nation state with an army. They had to change to being a people that, okay, we really need to cut our losses on this whole militaristic violence thing. We need to stop engaging in that. We need to stop trying to maintain our nation state because it's untenable in the face of this military supremacy of the Greeks and then the Romans. We have to totally reformulate ourselves around other forms of power, non-military forms of power, and what you have left are the mercantile form and the priestly form. And that's how Judaism completely changed itself and had a revolution around these two archetypes. So there might be some people who are angry. There might be some people, and I've heard people say things like, well, if we have to change who we are, if we have to become like Jews, then I'd much rather just kill myself. I've had people tell me that, and look, I can't force you to change yourself. And then you can also imagine someone who would say, hey, stop talking about, you can imagine Jews who would be angry because they're like, hey, stop blowing our cover. Stop talking about us in this way. We want to present ourselves, it's part of our strategy to present ourselves as weak as possible, as having no influence, as being 2% of the population, as being persecuted, as being underprivileged. That's part of our strategy to avoid persecution. You're blowing our cover, and they might be angry at me for that, and they might want to censor me for that. So you've got people on both sides who are like, hey, you know, by advocating this, you're anti-white. And at the same time, for the same videos, for the same message, people who would be saying, hey, you're harming Jewish interests and you should be censored. So, you know, I'm not really being a people pleaser here. It's a very niche argument. Ultimately, it's an aristocratic argument. Aristocracy meaning power to the excellent, which is the Toynbee idea, the creative minority, the dominant minority, the minoritarian strategy. That I'm not looking for a quantity of people here. I'm not looking to convert the alt-right, so to speak. There are, at this point, millions of people who, on some level or another, believe some version of the alt-right. I mean, if we look at the Daily Stormer, is the most successful alt-right website at this point. Amren, and again, Greg Johnson came on my channel in the comments. He didn't talk to me personally, but he left a comment and he said this video is ridiculous because, you know, I talked about the decline of the alt-right. I looked at the stats, I looked at the statistics, I said all your websites in the last few months are getting less and less and less views. Less people are engaging with your material. He said, well, that doesn't have to do with a lack of interest. Actually, white nationalism is growing. But unfortunately, because of the censorship by Google and Amazon, other big tech platforms, we have less views as a result because a lot of people come to the website through Google search, or a lot of people come to the website through, you know, Amazon book reviews or whatever. And so because of the systematic discrimination against us by big tech, we're being censored, and therefore it appears as if white nationalism is becoming less and less popular. Less people are reading these websites, less people are interested, but that's not true. More people are interested than ever. We're growing faster than ever. It's just they've manipulated the numbers to make it appear, and that's within their power. And I said, okay, but fine, all right, you know, I heard your argument, but here's the problem. The Daily Stormer is the most popular website, and in terms of both growth and absolute numbers. So while the Countercurrents has less and less viewers, Amren has less and less viewers, TRS has less and less viewers, these people are declining in viewership according to Alexa ratings and everything else. Daily Stormer is maintaining its viewership. So it doesn't have positive growth, but has neutral growth. It's not declining. And so both in its future trajectory and in terms of its current volume of viewers, the Daily Stormer is the predominant white nationalist website on the internet in the English-speaking world. It's not Countercurrent, it's not Amren, it's not TRS. Those are not the future of the white nationalist movement. Daily Stormer is the future. And I think it's very interesting to actually read, if you actually read the little insight articles where Anglin does something and it's not necessarily current events. It's not necessarily using racial slurs. It's not necessarily talking about non-white crimes or politics or whatever. When he talks about moral issues or something like that, and you read about what he has to say, you can disagree with him. You can call him evil or whatever, but he is a smart guy, and he is running the best. I mean, in terms of, again, the volume and the growth, he has better growth, even though he's not gaining any viewers. His growth is neutral. It's zero. He's doing way better than Jared Taylor. He's doing better than Greg Johnson. He's doing better than the rest. And in terms of the volume of his content, the volume of viewership, and the fact that if you actually read it, and this is my point, I just sort of got off track, but the point was, he has sort of abandoned white nationalism. He's been very pragmatic from the beginning. He said, my neo-Nazism is a tool that I use to provoke the mainstream media into giving me attention and viewership. And now that he's sort of reached the end of that cycle, he's moved on to something different. He's moved on to Andrew Yang. And again, if you actually read what the man himself writes, first he was a hardcore neo-Nazi. Everyone was, hey, man, you're making us look bad with all this Hitler worship. And then he does a total flip around and he says, no, I'm an American nationalist. He does a total flip around. And now he's saying, oh, I don't support Trump anymore. I support Andrew Yang as accelerationism. So 3 completely different phases. You have to understand the brutal pragmatism of this guy. But he is effectively able to maintain, on the one hand, a large neo-Nazi audience. On the other hand, he's able to draw in this American conservative, American nationalist audience, and then he's also drawing in people who are atheists, and then he's drawing in people who are traditional Christians. He's drawing in people who are really interested in health and fitness, and he's drawing in people who are angry at women and who are angry about gender confusion and things like that. So he's drawing in all these different audiences and juggling them and using hyperbole and using insulting language, inflammatory, hateful language. He's legally, according to the big disclaimer, we're opposed to violence, we seek revolution through other means. He is not being violent in his rhetoric, but take that for what you will. So that to me is the fascinating thing going on. What else can we talk about? Yeah, you read these articles, and it's a good source of news. When people put out news, and you go to news websites, and they got pop-ups everywhere, they've got ads everywhere. Everything is strictly controlled to be as boilerplate as possible. Literally, boilerplate means that which is just copied, and one person writes an article, and it's just the same tone. It feels like it's very bland, it's very uninteresting. We've got Owen Benjamin calls Alex Jones a lying scumbag. So, this is very strange. I don't know what's going on with Owen. Yeah, this is the other thing. We had the Alex Jones versus Joe Rogan saga, and now we have the Owen Benjamin versus Alex Jones saga. I don't know what's going on. I don't really exactly. Maybe my problem with Owen Benjamin is he seems like aggressively anti-evolution and aggressively like pro-Christian fundamentalism or whatever he's doing. And for that reason, I can't really get into Owen Benjamin. I can't really get into, who's the other one, Vox Day. It's kind of a turnoff when I have like a 30 or 40-year-old or even 50-year-old man telling me about how stupid evolution is. And again, I'm not even really concerned at this point with because I'm not a biologist. I don't care so much about biological evolution. But in terms of the concept of mimetic evolution, cultural evolution, like rejecting evolution metaphysically and saying it doesn't exist, we just have to read the Bible, and if you just read sola scriptura and you read the Bible and you live in your little log cabin in Western Oregon and you read the Bible, you're going to be all right. That to me seems to be a little bit naive, and I don't know if I can take people like that serious. Not to say that you shouldn't read the Bible. I think everyone should read the Bible. I'm not against the Bible, I'm not against the Christian tradition, but when people take it in an anti-evolutionary direction. I mean, to me, Christianity is an evolution of Judaism. So how can you reject evolution on a metaphysical level and yet embrace Christianity? That to me seems to be contradictory. Additionally, because Christianity talks about you have a heart of stone, you want to turn it to a heart of flesh. Well, on an individual level, that's a kind of evolution, even using a biological, organic metaphor, from stone to flesh, from the inorganic to the organic, changing the organs of the body. You know, we talk about the body of Christ being the body of believers. So I don't know. The anti-evolution rhetoric seems to me to be very, very strange and antiquated and fundamentalist and sola scriptura and literalistic. You know, I like the Bible, but as a metaphor and allegory and parables and things like that. So to take the creation story in Genesis literally, it's like you're not seeing the forest for the trees or something like that. You're kind of missing the point. Yeah, so all of that's very entertaining. A lot of stuff going on. Things going on that don't really matter. You know, again, this is my problem, that the first 5 minutes of the video should be me talking about the big current events of the day. And I think I probably have to go back to the Google News strategy. Let's see, what would have happened if I just went to Google News today instead of talking about health tips. I probably would have been talking about Jussie Smollett, first of all. And second of all, I would have probably been talking about Robert Mueller. I don't know if the Robert Mueller thing is old news now. Also, you have Brexit. The Brexit deal rejected by UK Parliament. So that was a big thing. Trump threatens to close the border. That's not going to happen. Gaza, Hamas, all the typical stuff. I don't see anything about Mueller in here. Wow. Rachel Maddow's ratings suffer after Mueller report determined no collusion. Wow. I kind of feel bad for her. Not really. Not really, but it's interesting. Gorsuch and Kavanaugh on opposite sides again, so what a waste of a saga that was. One of them's messed up here, but I don't know which one's all messed up. Buddhist inmate execution blocked. Justices say religious rights were violated. My goodness. These are the types of things I should be talking about in the first 5 minutes, and instead it's looking like the last 5 minutes. Very strange. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really care about the Mueller thing. It's like, I guess I'm supposed to chuckle about the fact that once again the mainstream media was just telling a bunch of lies, but I think everyone understands that at this point, so I'm not even sure what advantage that is. I mean, maybe in the long term, maybe that will be helpful. Maybe it will be beneficial in the long term, the Mueller story, the Jussie Smollett story. Maybe in the long term, people will look at that and say, maybe some 5-year-old boys, some 13-year-old boys are going to look at that and say, like, seems like the news just lies a lot, Mommy. Hey, Dad, seems like the news people lie. They said one thing, but a different thing happened. So what's going on here? It doesn't make sense. So maybe in the next couple of decades, these kind of stories will plant little seeds in people's minds that will help them to think critically in the future. So sure, I guess I can be excited about that, but the it's a long-term excitement. So rather than yelling hip hip hooray in the moment, it's more like a deep yes. Like my excitement will be dispersed over the next decade. Just a continuous slow burning excitement. It's not like a match that you light up and there's a flame. It's sort of a smoldering excitement that goes on for a while. The metric that I try to determine whether a video is successful or whether a video is a failure is, did I learn something from making the video? Do I feel like I've personally improved in the process of making the video, and in the idea of when I try to teach these ideas to other people, am I helping understand the flaws in what I'm saying? And when people make a when people make long comments, I feel like the longer the comments are, the better the video was. Not the number of comments. People could make 40 comments and they could all be like LOL, great video, whatever. But when someone makes when someone posts a 12-page long comment, and you know what I don't like? I don't like when people post 12 different short comments. Like they post 12 paragraphs of comments. It's like they're watching a video, they write a paragraph, they post that. They watch 10 more minutes, they write a paragraph, they post that. That's kind of annoying. I like it when you have one person who sits down and they write 12 pages. You know who's really good about this? You know who's really good? It's Ivan the Heathen. Dude, there was an Arvol video. There was an Arvol video on propertarianism that we're going to look up in a second. Wow, guys, strap yourselves in because we got a 26-part long comment chain here from 2 months ago by Ivan the Heathen. This is the stuff. I wish Ivan would comment on it. I understand he has a lot of things he needs to do, but let's dive in, shall we? Ivan the Heathen. When you invited me on your stream a while ago and asked me about Curt, I held back. But the truth is I never found his system interesting. I encountered his work at the same time you did, and the first portion of his work was his series of criticisms of Misesian praxeology and Austrian methodology in economics. At the risk of sounding extremely snide, his criticisms left me with the impression he hasn't read anything after 1940. He is utterly the prisoner of the operationalist, positivistic, I almost said positivisticist. Anyway, the positivistic approach to epistemology and metaphysics that peaked in popularity at about that time. Yes, positivism does have a metaphysics, and I'm not convinced that he's even capable of understanding that serious criticism of his approach exists, or treating those criticisms on their own terms. You mentioned he thinks that psychology is pseudoscience, but as you say, the real reasons he has for thinking that have to do with his discounting of the first-person point of view. To continue with the praxeology example, praxeology takes the structural relationship... Oh dear, I just lost. The structural relationships between means and ends as given because we know ourselves through introspective awareness to be beings with ends. We know that there are things that we want, and we further know that we inhabit a world which is limited in certain ways, thus requiring us to resort to various means to achieve the things that we want. Since we know that, we already have an a priori teleological framework in place that we can use to analyze action, and this is why a priori reasoning can actually tell us true things about some aspects of the real world, like in economics, for example. But Curt rejects this utterly. Teleology doesn't have a place in his worldview because there's no way to empirically verify it from a third-person perspective. There's also no way to do psychology in any intelligible way without at least implicit resorts to teleological concepts. How can we explain what emotions are and why the fact that a person may feel a given emotion in a certain context be revelatory about that person's character? There's no way to make sense of any of it if we accept the constraints of Curt's epistemology. Instead of taking this as a hint there might be something wrong with his epistemological approach, Curt instead chooses to bite the bullet and tread dangerously close to going full Paul Churchland on the subject of psychology. This bleeds into every other aspect of his worldview. For instance, the ultimate reason why Curt opposes lying and a trashing of the commons is that his survey of human anthropology has led him to the conclusion that all human societies that have opposed these things. He's making a straightforward empirical argument that is actually very easy to understand, but what's perverse about this, he doesn't attempt to engage with fundamental questions of right or wrong. He says, this is what people have empirically been observed to deem wrong, whatever wrong means, so we deem it wrong too. Curt thinks he can circumvent ethics, but this is a pipe dream. He's convinced himself this is somehow scientific, which is the central bugaboo of his whole worldview. I'll get around to that in a moment. Back when I was on a stream with you, I accused Curt of trying to revive Enlightenment-era anthropology. If it's really true that Curt would object to being characterized as one who would be trying to revive an Enlightenment-era anthropological project, the only thing that would show is that Curt needs to do more reading. Since the Enlightenment philosophies rejected the old scholastic concept of natural law, perverted as it was with teleology, which they dismissed as much as a superstitious mystification, they had to replace it with a new one and to rebuild ethics and politics from the ground up. They did this in Enlightenment fashion, ever so faithful to the scientific method. They examined large numbers of human societies spanning all sorts of epochs, cultures, languages, and climes in search of universal ethics, things that of all these societies condemned and abominated. Once they found these, they thought they would have a scientific or rational basis for calling something immoral. Predictably, this did not go far. Anyone who doubts that a program like this was popular during the Enlightenment can just read Montesquieu or Condillac. To give two examples, it's all there. Stripped of some of the fancy intellectual pyrotechnics that Curt sometimes likes to use, this is exactly the same as his own project. My interactions with Curt have been minimal, but a few years ago I asked him what the basis was for his condemnation of lying and commons destruction as opposed to any number of other things. He replied that he condemned this because that is what humans have been empirically observed to condemn, and so therefore any approach that condemned other things or that arrived at conclusions about what to condemn in a different way that was different from his own was pseudoscientific. But of course, what humans have empirically been observed to condemn has not always been consistent. This is the same rock on which the hopes of the Enlightenment philosophies were dashed. That's where the value of a priori reasoning from first principles comes in. It can help you avoid stuff like that, but Curt doesn't want to hear this. He insists it's all pseudoscience, and when I realized that he ultimately had no further or deeper justification for his most basic epistemological views than to point at opposing camps and chant pseudoscience, I quickly lost interest in the man. That is the exactly the same kind of witch doctory hocus pocus that Curt claims to oppose. I perceived this very quickly and genuinely surprised most people did not. Curt is notoriously bad at communicating his thoughts in writing, but his ideas are not difficult to understand in themselves. As a rule of thumb, be suspicious of anyone who communicates simple ideas in complicated or obscure language. Okay, hat tip to that comment. I'm sorry to those who revere him, but Curt strikes me as not even being aware of his own prejudices and superstitions. The scientific method is not simple, neutral reasoning. It has limits. It also has metaphysical scaffolding that holds itself up and that goes deeper than the scientific method can itself go. To discuss fundamental questions of social organization without even touching on this has always smelled fraudulent to me. I'm not saying that Curt is stupid, not at all. But I'm saying he stands to benefit enormously from doing more reading. I've seen him frequently cite Percy Bridgman's work on scientific methodology and philosophy of science as if it's cutting edge. Bridgman wrote his books on the philosophy of science in the 20s and 30s, and Curt seems to believe that nothing of value has been done in the field since. It's difficult to know what to even say about this. He seems to think that philosophers all collectively took their balls and went home sometime in 1940 or so. At least that's the impression you get from reading him. Curt is not a genius either. Maybe this is just me, but I can't call someone a genius if I'm quickly able to perceive flaws in his work if he's not able to effectively respond to those who point out the flaws. My very strong suspicion is that people who consider Curt a genius do so to the extent largely because they have been psychologically browbeaten by him into thinking with his staunchness and assertiveness. Curt, if you're reading this, stop reading and go read some recent philosophy of science. I recommend W.V.O. Quine's and J.J.C. Smart's work. Why do both of those guys have 4 different names? Their discussions of context dependence in science, which very effectively show that even something as basic as an empirical observation is not as cut and dried as many think it is, are particularly valuable and should give you a lot to think about. Even though there's much that I disagree with Quine about, Two Dogmas of Empiricism is a very important paper. Smart's book, Philosophy and Scientific Realism, is very valuable as well. In epistemology, try Laurence Bonjour's book. His last name is literally hello. Try Laurence Bonjour's book, In Defense of Pure Reason, for a perspective very different from your own. There's actually a legitimate and serious case to be made for the existence of a priori knowledge and justification. Chanting pseudoscience is not enough to effectively deal with that case. But I had no idea that he wrote plans to overthrow governments. That suddenly makes him much more interesting. I'm not going to call anyone a government plant unless I have some pretty direct evidence that they are, and in this case I don't, so I'll just stay silent about that. A much simpler explanation is he's incorrigibly narcissistic and wants to be adored as a genius, which is not mutually exclusive with his being fed, but is still much easier to demonstrate. Also, I think you have ascribed too much power to governments. The Soviet Union collapsed very quickly once enough people stopped believing in it, despite it being the most repressive and powerful government on earth. I have to reject that statement right there. He says the same can happen with the United States or any other government. I think you're far too skittish and far too prone to taking the government's own boasting about its power. I agree with you about Doolittle. Okay, so I disagree with that. The Soviet Union collapsed because America and NATO and Europe and the white diaspora nations were much more powerful than the Soviet Union. Nixon made a deal with China. They isolated the Soviet Union. It was the Anglos, it was the Germans, it was the Americans, it was Europeans at large, plus China were all against the Soviet Union. And they demolished the Soviet Union. It was a controlled demolition from the inside. And I think we're going to find out in the coming years. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, 1989 basically. And when you look at the declassification, we still don't know everything about JFK. Okay, JFK was assassinated how many years ago? Almost 50, 60 years ago now. We still haven't unclassified, or we're just recently declassifying JFK stuff. So it's going to be 50 or 60 years. We're not going to realize how the Soviet Union was actually brought down until 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060. We're still a long way off actually understanding how the Soviet Union collapsed. So this concept that, oh, well, people just stopped believing in the Soviet Union and it collapsed, that is not true. That is false. If you look at the video footage, there were people protesting the collapse of the Soviet Union, people who were protesting the destruction of the Soviet Union. And I think it was a Western con job. The way that people describe 9/11, now I don't really care about 9/11. 3,000 people died, and we went off and we killed 500,000 brown people in response who were not responsible. Okay, Saddam Hussein was not responsible for 9/11. Osama bin Laden was a United States government employee. Pakistan, which harbored Osama bin Laden, was a United States ally. Saudi Arabia produced the citizens who hijacked the plane. Israel supported Saudi Arabia. So the whole thing is just a cluster of just nonsense. So from the start to the finish, it's all nonsense. I don't care, did the planes actually hit the buildings? Was there explosives in the bottom? The execution of the event is totally irrelevant to me. The fact is that the background, the foreground, the entire context of the event, the narrative was shaped around it. I don't care how the buildings fell. I care how the falling of the buildings was used to justify something totally irrelevant to the falling of the buildings. They used a state called Saudi Arabia, supported by a state called Israel, and they took a guy called Osama bin Laden, a government employee of the United States who was harbored in Pakistan, an ally of the United States. They took that whole network of terrorism and they blamed it on Saddam Hussein, a secular dictator who we now know was containing the forces of ISIS and was containing these Wahhabist extremists. And he was fighting against them. And they attacked Saddam Hussein, they attacked Muammar Gaddafi, they attacked Bashar al-Assad, and they used 9/11 as a justification. And they said there were weapons of mass destruction, and Colin Powell lied. And so I view the con job of 9/11 is really just a rehearsal or an after effect or just doing the same thing over again that was done with the Soviet Union. I think the Soviet Union was a controlled demolition. I think it was a total setup. I don't think it was organic. I don't think the people just decided we hate the Soviet Union now. And I don't think it was, oh, well, I guess we just give up. We're just going to give up without firing a shot. I think you look at Boris Yeltsin, and he was a United States government employee. And it was a United States psyop to bring down the Soviet Union. It wasn't this natural organic. Well, I guess they just didn't like communism anymore. It's not the case at all. So I totally disagree with that. But let's go on. Let's go to Curt Doolittle's response, because that's just the first out of a 26 long. I hope you have some time today. I hope you can timestamp the video. Go do whatever, Come back to this video tomorrow and watch the video starting here, because we're going to get into part 2 of a 26-part series. Am I actually doing this? Am I actually this crazy? Let's find out. The Propertarian Institute, Curt Doolittle, he makes his response. I think it's odd that you would make that line of arguments. Reading? Have you seen my reading list? That's a tiny fraction of it. Of course and then nothing comes after that sentence. So it's hard to read Curt Doolittle's writing because he starts sentences and doesn't finish them. You clearly have not read How I Define Natural Law. I have read things after 1940. I started with artificial intelligence. I worked backward through history with Searle, Chomsky, Turing, cognitive science. I based my work on that field of science, not the analytical movement. Your 1940s argument doesn't grasp the connection between the failure of the operational movement in mathematics, where it was adopted, and where it was increasingly necessary, economics, sociology, psychology, and language, and areas where it was adopted, computer science, cognitive science, current mathematics. Why logicians failed, there's no closure, so only falsification is possible within each language. You don't mention my criticism of set logic and idealism, or the grammars, which is my basis of the critique of philosophy from Kant and the Continentals to Wittgenstein, Russell, and the Anglos. You are conflating philosophy positive with the law negative, and that seems very difficult for you to grasp the difference between the epistemological spectrum of meaning, of possibility, and of testimony. The test, of course, is whether you would prefer that when you prosecuted people applied the empirical or some other arbitrary means of prosecuting you, that the law has always demanded third-person observability because of incentives to lie or at least engage in wishful thinking, and the pretense of knowledge that empiricism was a Western invention precisely because our law has been empirical from the early Bronze Age, so that law is a via negativa means of eliminating falsehoods and removing doubt via tests of incentives, means, mode of opportunity, and more recently intent. That you don't mention the purpose of law as I work on it to end Marxist, postmodernist, feminist, pseudoscience, and sophism in public discourse, and to end the use of pill-pull idealism or postmodernism, to use weakness in the common law constitution, to legislate via the bench, nor how strictly constructed law in operational language from the first principle of reciprocity prohibits these attacks on sovereignty or liberty if you're enlightenment and freedom if archaic. that physical science already makes use of operational language and that economics does not, for the reasons the Austrians warned, and the primary transformation in psychology has been the operationalist movement, that when you say context dependent, you're suggesting relativism rather than paradigms that make use of synonyms but which converge on the universe's parsimony and determinism consistency in brackets. And you're making a seems-like argument, which means free association, not consistent relations. There are criticisms of my work. I post them often, but as yet no one has offered any material criticism, not one. All I get are pragmatisms from young men who are smart and prefer authoritarianism because they have no experience organizing anything, even a family. National Socialists who prefer intolerant authoritarianism, young men who cling to the possibility of anarchism, a range of men who cling to the hope of authoritarian religious restoration, not knowing how lucky we are to have escaped it, the room temperature IQ crowd that attempts to participate or observe a discourse that is beyond their knowledge and ability, but that is too impatient to wait for the full constitutional changes and the policies that arise from them that would bring them relief. The only extant criticisms I can find, despite trying everything, are people who want a positive religion supernaturalism, philosophy sophism, a pseudoscience, or narrative excuse, not law, or policy that would benefit them, people who want to preserve their right to advocate for the supernatural sophistries, pseudoscientific, or excuses rather than doing so truthfully scientifically, that proprietarianism's grammars, operationalism, epistemology, and strict construction are too hard for ordinary people to understand. He misspelled the word understand as understand. Not that he spelled the word understand incorrectly twice. Maybe he's writing on a phone with autocorrect. Understand. It is too hard for ordinary people to understand, not that they understand. Understand the calculus, programming, or the law as it stands today, yet they live under them. Because of these reasons, it will not be possible to form a majority movement to enact these policies and that law producing those benefits. There is no surviving criticism of the grammars or the epistemology or the law that I know of, and grown-ups, meaning those of us who have built organizations of any scale or worked large organizations or in government or in finance or in the judiciary, are quite well aware that the world operates by rules, and those rules consist of legislation, regulation, and findings of law, and that everything else exists within it, not because these people believe in the law via positiva, but because they fear the consequences of not doing so. The purpose of religion is regional social mindfulness. The purpose of philosophy is local personal mindfulness. And now my frickin' the mouse is spazzing out. It's like too much Curt Doolittle. He's too high level for me. I can't. Oh no. Okay. We're gonna somehow get out of this situation. We're gonna fix this mouse by rubbing it vigorously. It's overheating. It's overheating with the power of whatever we're doing here. Okay, we're gonna massage it. See, I can't. Can I even pause the video? Okay, we're back. Man, this is a big thing here. This is a big thing we're doing. Okay, where are we? We were just at via positiva. Okay. The purpose of religion is regional social mindfulness. The purpose of philosophy is local personal mindfulness. The purpose of science is universal language of truthful speech. The purpose of the natural law is a universal method of prosecuting imposition of costs upon others involuntarily. The purpose of legislation and regulation is to enforce the terms of the local contracts in the production of commons. The difference in the production of commons is determined by Asian dictatorial corporate, European bipartite state versus citizen, Anglo egalitarian sovereign presumptions. So my opinion is that if you cannot argue against the beliefs, policies, and the construction of the law, and the creation for a market of non-false religion, non-false philosophy, non-false science, then you don't much matter other than preventing good people who are willing to act to obtain material benefits and the rewards of a society far more free of falsehoods, then you don't matter. But here is what the data says. People online in France at present, we have great evidence, are negatively correlated with activism, taking action. That people are positively activists in order to obtain material benefits, that they will pursue these material benefits by any means that they can justify. People are happy to opine and presume knowledge. However, if you sit down, and there the mouse started spazzing out again. However, if you sit down, try to write a constitution that cannot be violate. Seriously, dude, I absolutely can't stand it. All right. Why is the mouse just spazzing out randomly if I scroll up and down? What's wrong with this mouse? I'm trying to read Curt Doolittle here. Okay, people are happy to opine and presume knowledge. However, if you try to sit down, write a constitution which ends the industrialization of propaganda, disinformation, sophism, pseudoscience, and deceit in commercial finance, economic, and political spheres, you will find the problem is quite difficult. To do so requires a via negativa epistemology of eliminating falsehoods, which, if you try to sit down and try to produce, it's quite difficult. And once having done so, if you sit down and try to produce a set of policies that will eliminate commercial, financial, economic, political, and academic parasitism in all its forms, you will find it is quite difficult. If you sit down, you try to produce a plan by which a small percentage of costly men can bring a government to its knees such that it has no choice but to enact these constitutional amendments, end parasitism, and free a people from predation and genocide, you will find it is somewhat hard to do. Now, if you can find one single other person who can do any one of those things, I'd like to meet that person. If you can find that group of people to do all these things, I would love to know about them. Because from where I'm sitting, you folks haven't got a single other person living today with anything other than wishful thinking and empty words. And while I'd much rather sit around and work on my tech company and reap the economic rewards, I am not, unlike critics, extirpating my frustration with hollow nonsense to mask my lack of energy and agency and courage. I am not afraid of dying, and I don't lack agency. I have built companies of scale. I have built a body of thought on a scale only seen since the Marxists and perhaps since Smith and Hume. Wow, that is a huge claim. And much against my preference, I'm building a body of people capable of teaching and communicating the work, the policies, and the revolution to those who would have it. And if you have a criticism of anything material, you would make it. However, what I'm seeing is nothing more than a lack of understanding and straw-manning, self-confidence, absence, evidence of demonstrated ability, moral conviction that is admirable, but lacking the courage to do more than gossip. So Curt Doolittle is making this argument that if you haven't built a great company like I have, then you don't have the ability to make good arguments, which I don't think is a very good argument, frankly. So, as always, as you have noted, I follow the same technique wherever possible. Number 1, acknowledge the other good or ill intention. 2, deflate and disambiguate his... I don't think anything's been disambiguated. And disambiguate his argument, almost always an argument out of ignorance. Undermine the argument, almost always, as in the case a straw man due to ignorance. State how he can falsify your argument if an argument is to be had. There are only the arguments above to be had. Hold to reciprocity and return any disrespect, shaming, rallying, disapproval, ridicule, gossip, stated or implied, in order to incite the individual to persist in the argument until iteratively he exposes his lack of knowledge, overconfidence, arrogance to the audience. Then post the conversation to train members of the group in how these arguments are deconstructed and defeated through deflation and disambiguation of vacuous arguments and strawmen. Priests lie, commerce frauds, law decides. Thus endeth the lesson. Cheers. Priests lie? I don't know, man. Does DNA lie? Is DNA language? Is language the domain of the priest? Commerce frauds? I don't know. Commerce frauds, that's a big... You just told me if you haven't run a company, then nothing you say has any weight. But you tell me commerce frauds? Law decides. Where do we get our law? Where do we get legality from? Don't we get it from, like, culture? Don't we get it from religion? Don't we get it from our DNA? Don't we get it from... I don't know. All right. We could make a... I guess his counter-argument was DNA is evolution, and evolution is empiricism, and empiricism is what I'm pushing forth. Let's go on to Ivan's response. Man, that was hard to read. It's hard to read Curt Doolittle. because he doesn't post sentences, he posts bullet points. It's like the epitome of boomer posting. I don't get it. I would think old people from the 19th century would be able to write, like, cohesive paragraphs, but for some reason boomers just can't do it. Boomers have to write in bullet points. I don't understand. Let's go on to Ivan the Heathen. Okay. Ivan the Heathen says, I looked at your reading list. There is nothing on it about the philosophy of science. There is no work cited or recommended from Bas van Frassen, Alexander Bird, Stephen Mumford, Nancy Cartwright, Brian Ellis, Hilary Putnam, J.J.C. Smart, Quine, or anyone else who has written anything directly relevant to the philosophy of science in the last 80 years. Nothing. Anyone who doubts me can look for themselves. I have never, not once, seen you cite work from anyone in the philosophy of science other than Percy Bridgman, and the ideas about operationalism and the like that you do cite all data from originally book published in 1927. As for natural law, even the definition that you give of it in your glossary, which is uncontroversial in itself, has nothing to do with the subject of the philosophy of science. You're just blowing smoke, trying to cover your ass. That kind of mysticism might work on someone who isn't familiar with the relevant material, but it won't work on me. Maybe Percy Bridgman was right about what the proper scientific methodology is, and maybe what follows from his relatively anti-realist position about things like underdetermination, the status of laws of nature, context dependence in science, etc. is correct. But there have been criticisms of his approach since 1940. To show that operationalism is right, you actually have to defend it against those criticisms. And to do that, you actually have to know what the criticisms are. I've seen no evidence whatsoever that you do. You have to actually engage with the relevant literature and philosophy of science before you can make sweeping claims about having established some revolutionary new system that overturns all thought in the field. And then he quotes Doolittle. This clinches it. You really haven't read anything in philosophy of science written after 1940. Honestly, this reply makes me suspect that you don't even know what's meant by the term philosophy of science. Turing was not a philosopher of science. He had no original writings of his own on any of the classic problems in the field, especially on the question of scientific methodology and the interpretation of scientific results, which is what we're primarily concerned about here. Searle writes primarily on philosophy of mind and the philosophy of language, not philosophy of science. Russell never wrote any technical philosophical work on philosophy of science after 1940 that was not a rehash of things that he had said previously. This includes his 1948 book, Human Knowledge, which was primarily a book on epistemology, but which touched heavily on the philosophy of science. Chomsky has expressed some thoughts on philosophy of science over the years, but they all come from other people, like Hilary Putnam, whom you should read. Again, I mean his work in philosophy of science, not philosophy of mind or artificial intelligence. You mentioned cognitive science. Who knows why? Cognitive science is not philosophy of science. It's concerned with entirely different problems. Problems in philosophy of science underlie questions in cognitive science, as do questions in all fields of science, but they are logically prior to the specific questions of any given field. Philosophy of science is about questions like, what is the status of scientific theories? Do they describe the world as it truly is, or are they merely collections of statements that allow us to make accurate predictions and explain our empirical observations? Or, what is the status of unobservable entities in scientific theories like electrons, gravitons, or tachyons? May we say that they truly exist, or must we remain agnostic about their existence? Or, what is a law of nature, and how are statements of these laws different from other types of statements? Or, does the fact that scientific theories are always underdetermined by evidence pose a significant problem for scientific realism? Or, what are observations in science and what do they mean? Cognitive science has precisely nothing to do directly with any of these questions. This is the kind of thing that makes me suspicious that you hardly know anything about the philosophy of science, and you've only made me more suspicious than I was before. If your best attempt to convince me that your knowledge of philosophy science is up to date is to cite Bertrand Russell, then you really have no idea how much you don't know. your little hand-wavy comment on analytical philosophy doesn't inspire confidence in your knowledge of the relevant material either. I brought up a specific group of philosophers working in a specific area of philosophy who were advocating a specific position within that field, scientific realism, and your response was to issue a sweeping indictment of analytic philosophy as a whole, completely ignoring the fact that I'm not talking about analytic philosophy as a whole. I'm talking about a specific set of arguments from a specific set of people that should be considered and evaluated. What you're doing is hand-waving and kicking up dust, and it's just more evidence that you haven't actually read anything recent in the relevant field. But I'll give you a chance, Curt. You say you're familiar with Quine, though you only mention him in connection with artificial intelligence, not with the field that is actually relevant to this discussion, which is philosophy of science. In that case, what are the criticisms that Quine makes of the verification theory of meaning and two dogmas of empiricism? No cheating. Don't use Google. None of the recent philosophers of science that I mentioned confined their work only to the problems posed by positivism, operationalism, anti-realism to mathematics. Putnam, Quine, and Smart said plenty about fields like physics. More importantly, they were talking about scientific problems and methodology in general, not restricted to any particular scientific discipline. And it's in that respect that their criticisms of 1930s-style operationalism must be reckoned with. I still don't have the slightest indication that you actually grasp this. Furthermore, scientific realists have not ignored things like economics and psychology. Ian Hacking and Harold Kincaid are philosophers of science that have focused on psychology. Hacking on the status of mental illness as a conceptual category and of the ontological status of specific mental illnesses like multiple personality disorder. Rewriting the Soul is a great book. And Kincaid on psychological classification in general and whether psychological categories can be plausibly said to be natural kinds. Both of them are scientific realists. Both reject operationalism and positivism, as does the great majority of the field. Those are just two. There are many others. Again, maybe you're wrong to reject these views, but if you actually have to engage with their criticisms and show why they're wrong before you can declare it just to be so. In economics, John Earlman has written a lot on the ceteris paribus clause that one often sees in economic statements. He's not an operationalist at all. And then there are the writings of Austrians like Menger and Mises on methodology, which I'm honestly not convinced you've read either. I've seen you say that Mengerianism used the tools of calculus, lol. That's a bit like saying that Copernicus was a geocentrist. Manger does not use or does not mention mathematical techniques even once in any of his published writings on economics. Errors of that magnitude cannot be explained by a mere failure of comprehension. The only reasonable explanation is that you didn't read their work. You're simply wrong that operationalism failed in only one or a few areas. It was criticized to death in all areas, but you never discuss these criticisms. You never attempt to rebut them. And since I've never seen you cite anyone in philosophy science other than Bridgman, the only reasonable conclusion I can draw is you don't know any of these criticisms because you haven't written anything on the subject after the heyday of logical positivism. And Curt says, he's quoting Curt to say, it seems like you're making a seems like argument. No, Curt. I'm making what's called an inductive argument, or an inference to the best explanation. It works like this. People who have read work in the philosophy of science written after 1940 generally don't adopt hardline positivist positions, or if they do, at least try to make some attempts to answer criticisms of that view since 1940. You adopt hardline positive view of philosophy of science and do not reckon with the relevant criticisms. Therefore, you probably haven't read the relevant work. Of course, this argument doesn't have deductive certainty. No inductive argument does. That's not what inductive arguments are. You would think someone who appreciates science like you do would realize this, since inductive arguments are everywhere in science. And then he goes on, the problem is that it seems very difficult for you to grasp that the alternatives to empirical means of acquiring knowledge are not necessarily arbitrary merely on account of their being distinct from empirical means. This is a false dichotomy, and more importantly, there isn't always a clear dividing line between empirical and non-empirical knowledge. Example, let's say you kill someone but there are no witnesses and you've left no prints or DNA. How can a court establish your guilt? Well, people conduct a forensic analysis of the crime scene, but there are two problems. Oh boy. The mouse. Oh, don't mess up on me now, mouse. Don't mess up on me now. Oh, don't you do that, mouse. We don't want you messing around. Gotta buy a new laptop, folks. New laptop, new mouse pad. Okay. We're back, right? Inductive arguments. Okay, killing people. How can a court establish your guilt? People can conduct a forensic analysis of the crime scene, but there are two problems. The forensic analysis would not establish that you killed the person, merely that the person was killed. Number two, the much deeper problem that the forensic analysis itself relies on prior statements about things like the physics of blood spatter, coagulation, the decay of dead bodies, which themselves have to be empirically verified independently of that forensic analysis. And then the statements which compose the verification of those statements have to be verified, and then the statements which verify those statements, and then the statements which verify those statements ad infinitum, which means that it's not possible to empirically verify any single statement in isolation, because each statement necessarily comes embedded in the context of other statements which themselves have to be verified. The same is true of the operationalist criterion. You can't give an operational definition of any single term, because all the terms in the definitions themselves have to be given operational definitions. And then all of the terms in those definitions have to be given operational definitions, and so on. You can't verify or operationally define any statement or term individually. At best, you can only operationally define or verify all statements, all terms or statements collectively as a single entity. This, by the way, is what I was talking about when I spoke of context dependence earlier. So your talk of relativism is just misguided. This has nothing to do with relativism in any traditional sense. You just didn't understand what I was saying. But there's a massive problem with this. Pay attention, because this is where the punchline of the argument comes in. As you expand all of the statements on which the court's forensic analysis depends, and all of the statements upon which those statements depend on, etc., you will eventually come to metaphysical statements like, my perceptions are reliable, or it is possible to have true and accurate knowledge of the real world, etc. There is no way to non-circularly give operational definitions for these types of statements. You can't define the reliability of perception in terms of what works, because what works is itself defined in terms of the reliability of perception, and so on. Since it is only possible to operationally define all statements as a whole but never individually, the fact that you can't operationally define certain metaphysical statements collapses the entire operationalist program, and not just in certain restricted areas like in mathematics, but everywhere. To answer your question, of course I would like for a court to use empirical means in determining guilt or innocence, but that completely misses the point. The point is that that's not the only thing that the court uses in determining guilt or innocence. No court ever has or ever could conduct all of its evaluative procedures purely on the basis of what is operationally defined and nothing else. That's conceptually impossible. No court would ever be able to convict anyone of anything if it operated in that way, because in all cases, at least some of the statements underlying the reasoning in the conviction would be of a metaphysical nature. The question is not, would I prefer a court to be empirical and rely on third-person means of verification, or would I instead like it to read some tea leaves? That's stupid, Curt. No one believes that, and that's a pretty vicious straw man to portray those who disagree with you as thinking like that. The real question is, would I like a court to rely on empirical verification, but ungrid? Maybe he means undergird, maybe he means ungrid, I don't know. But ungrid that with a proper dose of the necessary non-empirical metaphysics as well? Or would I prefer that the courts insisted on the third-person empirical and nothing, and absolutely nothing else ever in any case? I think he means undergird. And would it even be conceptually possible for any court to ever declare guilt or innocence on any matter whatsoever if it consistently followed the purely empirical and third-person recommendation? I'm going to ignore the rest of what you said. The rest is just rhetorical. Don't hold back. Don't hold back. That's the initial statement. Don't hold back. You deprive me of good criticism and others of similar doubt from an advocate. So let's dance. I'll correct you, educate the audience, and create a test of falsifiability for anyone attempting criticism. All caps, what are we actually debating? So first, yes, you're making an inductive rather than informed argument, making a seems-like argument, and you haven't once demonstrated awareness of these central arguments or addressed them. Secondly, you are making an accusation that is not only the opposite of my line of reasoning, but in doing so, demonstrating the problem I seek to correct. So let's educate you on the bare minimum of the content so you have some idea what you're arguing against other than your imaginary straw man. Problem statement. How do we prohibit ignorance, error, bias, wishful thinking, loading, framing, suggestion, obscurantism, the fictionalisms of sophism in all of its forms, pseudoscience in all of its forms, and supernaturalism in all of its forms, and outright deceits from commercial, financial, economic, political, legal, and academic, pedagogical speech, and by use of the law and its market competition, while not limiting or prohibiting truthful speech? In particular, how do we prohibit both Platonic sophisms of idealism and Abrahamic sophisms of pill-pull critique, and their applications in theology, philosophy, math, and the logic's interpretation of scripture, text, history, and law, and their reformation as the pseudoscience of Marxism, the sophism of postmodernism, and the denialism of feminism? Proposition. It is possible to complete the scientific method such that any testimony in all caps, given in defense of an accusation of either falsehood or irreciprocity or both, that imposes a cost on the informational commons, the commons upon which the public depends for commercial, financial, economic, legal, political, and academic pedagogical information, has failed a test of due diligence against ignorance, pretense of knowledge, error, bias, wishful thinking, loading, framing, suggestion, obscurantism, the fictionalisms, and deceits. It is possible to do so by this argument. Whereas man defends investment of time, effort, resources, foregone opportunity. I think that the word is opportunity cost here. Foregone opportunity, reproductive proximity. And where defended investments consist of self-property, body, time, actions, memory, concepts, status, etc., personal property, house, cars, things, etc., kinship property, mates, children, family, friends, etc., cooperative property, organizational and knowledge ties, shareholder property, recorded and quantified shares, citizenship, common property, territorial and capital interests, artificial property, informational, institutional property, manners, ethics, morals, myths, rituals. I think I'm pretty into the informational, institutional property. And then number 8, the formal, institutional property, religion, government, and laws. And where reciprocity consists of productive, fully informed, warranted, voluntary transfer, free, negative externality. And where irreciprocity in action consists of no less than murder, harm, theft, fraud in all its forms, free riding in all its forms, socialization of losses, privatization of commons, blackmail, rent-seeking, conspiracy, propagandizing, poisoning the well, conversion, poisoning the well. How is conversion a loss? Immigration, predatory warfare, conquest, genocide. And where irreciprocity in speech consists in speech, intent to lie, intent to deceive, failure of due diligence against falsehoods, carrier of falsehoods, lies and deceits, carrier of tradition and culture of lies and deceits, a genetic predisposition to lie and deceive. Oh boy. And where due diligence must expose pretense against ignorance and error, bias and wishful thinking, suggestion, obscurantism, loading and framing, fictionalism, sophism, pseudoscience, and supernaturalisms, outright deceits. And where truthful speech consists of that which survives tests of the hierarchy of dimensions conceivable by man, the categorically consistent identity, the internally consistent logic, externally correspondent empirical, the operationally consistent, the existentially possible, the rationally consistent, the rational choice, the reciprocally consistent, the reciprocal rational choice, consistent within scopes, limits, and full accounting, complete, and consistent across the 7 dimensions, coherent, and where, he writes, and where, and then below that, and where both display, word, and deed are limited to actions for which restoration is possible, warranted by sufficient resources to perform restitution. Therefore, if speech survives the dimensional tests of consistency of dimensions conceivable by man, is limited to that which words and deeds are open to restitution, and where such speech is warranted by sufficient resources to perform restitution, either directly or by insurer, then due diligence against falsehood and reciprocity has been made, and no crime has been committed. You can try to falsify that line of reasoning. Closing comment. The most reductive form of this epistemology, the grammars, the operational grammar, are the basis of the work. If you can understand this, then the rest of the work follows. What are the grammars? The equivalent of the periodic table for speech. In particular, operational grammar provides the means of constructing well-formed statements, sentences, collections of sentences, and summary sentences. The grammar's diagram, I'm not sure how current it is, not very, but close enough. And then he attaches some PDF, which is the periodic table of speech draft 2. How long is this, Curt? How long? I can't load it. It's not. Oh my gosh. It literally is a periodic table. If you're following along, which I hope you are, because I don't know how you would comprehend any of this unless you're reading along with me, but you click on this link, deflation, measurement, empowerment, individualism, generating competition, masculine reproductive strategy, political tribalism. And then he has all this stuff. Generation 1, recipes, recording, reporting, the legal agrarian age, the mathematical commercial age, the scientific industrial age, the algorithmic information age, the autonomous sentient age, communication, honesty, negotiation, deception. Oh my gosh, dude. Just look at this PDF. He's like, he defines Abrahamism as his biggest enemy, and he's talking, oh my goodness. There's just so much. There's so much here. 3 of these he write ignored. Like, you're not going to understand. We got the Frankfurt School, Marx, Boas, Freud, Mises, Rand, Rothbard. Wow! This dude's anti-Semitic. Have you realized that? Abraham and rabbinical Judaism. This guy's intense. You look at this, and you have to ask yourself, you have to look at this and you have to ask yourself, have you ever built an organization like Curt Doolittle? Have you ever built a periodic table of speech before? Whoa. Alright, part 2. Curt continued, The Revenge of Curt Doolittle. The program is entirely, this is not a word, falsificationary. The program is entirely falsificationary. You adopt a hardline positivist view in philosophy of science and do not reckon with the relative criticisms. And Curt responds to that Ivan quote. He says, nope, the opposite. Actually, I make use of tests of due diligence such that if one pretends knowledge that cannot be explained with a sequence of testable operations, one cannot possibly warranty one is uttering truthful speech, because one cannot therefore possibly warranty that he knows of that which he speaks. You can try to falsify that statement. In fact, search my site for the word verify. If you find it at all, either someone else said it that I'm debunking, or as criticism of its use in general. Conversely, search for the frequency of the word justificationism to get a measure of how frequently I criticize justificationary thought. This pretty much eradicates everything you've said, but let's continue. Operationalism in speech as a means of falsification. Operational semantics, vocabulary, and grammar in complete sentences, like all other mathematical, logical, algorithmic grammars, produces well-formed statements that are testable or not. The reason that operations are sympathetically, I think he means systematically, but operations are sympathetically testable whether they involve thought, word, or deed. In other words, operations produce universal commensurability and testability in testimonial speech. You can try to falsify that statement. I love that little you can try to falsify that statement. The operational movement. You didn't read or understand my arguments that the movement failed because they only had discovered falsification and failed to grasp the extent of it. In other words, logics don't prove anything except the negative. Their only positive use is to limit the range of falsification to marginal indifference, a statement which is fairly easy to demonstrate in mathematics. General rules of arbitrary precision, given scale independence from the square root of 2 to infinitesimals. The best we can do is to approximate the point of marginal indifference in application, action, and reality. You can try to falsify any of those statements. Regarding positivism, people who have read work in the philosophy of science written after 1940 generally don't adopt these things. So he's quoting Ivan here. And then he responds, please find where I have a positive or view in the philosophy of science when every single method I use is exclusively falsificationary. Now, what demarcates science, due diligence, from non-science? Failure of due diligence. Testifiability. Try to falsify that statement. History, this is in all caps, history, where did science and the scientific method originate? In the application of practical court law of tort to practical testimony in the physical sciences. This is why the principal theorists, from Aristotle to Bacon to Hayek, have either begun or ended with the law. And why? Of the domains of inquiry, only the law tests every possible dimension of human cognition, action, and testimony, and unlike the other high degrees available, medicine, philosophy, theology, it was the only one with a feedback loop. Try to falsify that statement. And why does it matter? Law. Natural law of reciprocity and the common law of tort, not command, legislation, or regulation, only decides matters of conflict. It is falsificationary. You can prove nothing, only falsify claims, which is what the court consists of and which frustrates the average individual who is incognizant of the function of the law. So what's the hierarchy of sciences? However we define them, from least number of dimensions testable to the most number of dimensions testable, which science has the greatest demand on those claims that are scientific law? Try to falsify that statement. Continued. Regarding. Okay. So he quotes Ivan. Ivan says, it seems very difficult for you to grasp that the alternatives to empirical means of acquiring knowledge are not necessarily arbitrary merely on account of their being distinct from empirical means. That is a false dichotomy. More importantly, there isn't always a clear dividing line between empirical and non-empirical knowledge. Curt says, that is a positivist statement. Conversely, no means of identifying an opportunity, hypothesis, theory, law has any bearing on its truthfulness, survivability from falsification. In the series, free association, hypothesis, theory, law, metaphysical presumption, all potential knowledge, which we must define before we say much about it, must survive the market test of falsification by reasonableness, hypothesis, falsification by testing theory, falsification by market application, strong theory or law, and falsification by persistent presumption, metaphysical value, judgment. So apparently you have failed to grasp that no means of acquiring stories, categories, hypotheses, theories, paradigms, networks of theories, ontologies, networks of paradigms, and of changes in state convey decidability in matters of dispute. And apparently you can't tell the difference between meaningful, communicatable, reciprocal, agreement, truthful, warranted against falsehood, and decidable statements, and the identification of opportunity meaningful, and the prohibition on the seizure of opportunity law, or the difference between the possible, the preferable, the good, the truthful, and the decidable, or the difference between the demand for decidability depending upon who is warranting the display word of deed, you and the dependents, you and the associates, you and the public, and you probably haven't picked up yet, despite my demonstrations, on the technique of using series to prevent errors of induction by conflation. If you need that explained to you, I will point you to detail. Regarding, here's a quote by Ivan. What this means is that it's not possible to empirically verify any single statement in isolation, unquote. Curt responds, we don't verify anything, we falsify it. We falsify it by the full set of dimensions, coherence. We falsify it most often by means, motive, and opportunity. Although, due to malincentives of police and prosecutors, motive may be extended to intent as a matter of reform. You don't prove your innocence. The prosecution's function is to falsify your innocence. Wow, that's an intense statement. You are innocent until your innocence is falsified. Wow, so they don't verify that you're guilty, they falsify that you're innocent. See, that, to me, the basic law is that you must be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the word proof there, I would call that a synonym. This is me talking. I'm not reading Curt anymore. This is me talking, saying that if you prove someone is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, it kind of means you're verifying their guilt. Whereas Curt is turning that around. He's saying you must falsify their innocence. Falsify their innocence. So does that mean any form of perjury? I mean, what does that mean, falsify their innocence? It seems to be sort of a word game in the opposite of what actually goes on in the courtroom. What actually goes on with the American jury system, the American system of law that we depend on, says you have to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to verify their guilt through evidence, positive innocence. And he says, we don't prove your innocence. The prosecution's function is to falsify your innocence. You're innocent until your innocence is falsified. Many cases are undecidable. Courts are by their nation. So I'm reading Curt again. Many cases are undecidable. Courts are by their nature forced into decisions. This drives the market for false claims to the margins. You can try to falsify that statement. Why I don't quote contemporary philosophers. As far as I know, the post-war argument is reducible to whether a method exists at all via positiva. No. Semantic problems given disciplinary paradigms. Context. The problems of limits of instrumentation. Observation and measurement. The problems of the limits of information from limits of instrumentation. Under determination. The limits of mathiness. He doesn't say mathematics. He says mathiness. Math, I-N-E-S-S. Mathiness. The limits of mathiness in the absence of frame, descriptive versus constructive, the economics of testing, utility and efficiency, the problem of declining returns and increasing costs, decidability and choice of avenue, almost always economic, role of scientists in society, and ethics. If there is something more meaningful, say Strawson, whose work I build upon, then please state what it is. But the point of demarcation is positive versus negative, what to do to obtain information versus what to do to perform due diligence and warranty your speech about that information. As far as I know, the scientific method consists of due diligence and a warranty of that due diligence against ignorance, error, bias, wishful thinking, suggestion, obscurantism, loading, framing, fictionalism, and deceit in the speech claims that we write or utter. In other words, the scientific method consists of whatever is necessary to perform that due diligence in whatever field of inquiry at current instrumental and logical scale, and have it survive tests of consistency in those categories of expression possible by man. You can try to falsify that statement. As we say, here's a quote, scientists... Okay, there's no end to the quote. He starts a quote, but he never ends it. There's just no end to that quote. As we say, scientists pay no mind to philosophers of science. It is an art craft of measurement in an effort to remove our ignorance, error, bias, and wishful thinking, and sometimes deceit. They have no choice but to pay mind to the law. You can try to falsify that statement. Summary. It is extremely difficult for the vast majority of people to think in falsificationary terms. and to unlearn justificationism. It is a smaller set of people that can abandon continuous appeals to intuition and produce streams of calculation, grammars. You are no different. There is a reason software folk have an easier time. They are already working in operational language at all times, and database normalization forces disambiguation. But for literary folk in general, who neither specialize in applied math, engineering, software, the hard sciences, or law, period. Obviously, he set up two contrasting sentences. He just put a period on there because he didn't want to finish the sentence. Closing. In my opinion, you are just another drive-by idiot. One more moron in a long line of people who reads a few bits of what he... I'm just going to read. I'm not going to try to fix his sentence. Who reads a few bits of what he most revolutionary thought in a century, and you waste my time defending what exists in extremis, thousands of pages of text, and by using the cheap vehicle of the internet to shame me into educating you in defense of duress, rather than you educating yourself before you speak in ignorance. You are not too stupid to understand. You may lack intellectual honesty, although I don't detect it. You may, like Arvol, lack agency, which is the most common weakness that cannot be overcome. You may lack will or courage to discover the truth, regardless of costs, and therefore simply seek to defend your investments, priors. But if you have an argument against the rough outline I have written here, let us hear it. Because I have spent a long time in every field. I'm a Renaissance man. He doesn't say he's a Renaissance man, but I've spent a long time in every field. Every field? Every field? He spent a long time in every field. And with every logical, empirical, moral question trying to defeat it, and I can't. Okay. Okay, guys. Whew! That was some Curt Doolittle. Ba 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 da 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 da. Ba ba da 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 da. This is like the next level of the video games loading. You got the elevator music. Ba 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 da 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 da. Ba da 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 da. Ba ba da 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 da. Ba ba da 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 da. Ooh, yeah, baby, I know you make me crazy, the way you come in here, the way you Curt Doolittle, Ivantheheathen. Okay, I think we're going to take, I just want to let people's brains relax, because if my brain is on fire right now, I'm sure your brains probably need a little chill. I think you should take this time as well to go grab some water, go get something to drink, and just have a little break before we jump into Ivantheheathen. Because there's a shift in tone between the two writers that we have to adjust. We have to sort of cleanse the palate of Curt Doolittle, and now we need to get back into Ivantheheathen. So, part 1. Oh boy. Reading through this, I realize it's going to be far more difficult getting through to you than I had initially imagined. Most terrifyingly of all, there are certain words that I have been using which I assumed you would know the definitions of. You don't, and it's causing you to hilariously misstate my arguments, such that at least 90% of what you've written here, while interesting, is completely irrelevant to anything I actually said. This is going to be a bit like teaching Greek to someone who doesn't know a word of it. It's doable, but it will take a good goddamn long time. Until this issue is resolved, it's not going to be possible for us to have a conversation. So this has to be done before anything else. Without this, we're going to be talking past each other the whole time. So here goes the definition of positivism. This is your core error. You don't understand what I mean by positivism. Positivism has nothing to do with the making of positive statements or claims. Let me repeat that. Positivism has nothing to do with the making of positive statements or claims. That's simply not what the term means. This is a technical term that refers to a specific philosophical movement that held certain views on subjects like the nature of science, logic, the place of observation as opposed to conceptual analysis, the limits and proper purpose of philosophy, etc. I'm going to try and explain the movement's core views to you. As you will see, Curt, these views are far, far from the opposite of yours. This is what happens when you don't do any reading in a particular area. Remember, Curt said he's spent time in every field, but did he get to this particular area? Let's find out. Back to Ivan. When you try to have a conversation on a subject in which you are not sufficiently well read, you will find that you can't do it because you aren't conversant with the relevant vocabulary. That is why I was giving you a hard time earlier about having not read certain things. But now I see that the problem is even worse than I initially thought it was. You have to be able to know about the philosophical movements and ideas that I referred to in my criticisms of you before you can even understand what the criticism amounts to. Until you do this, you will just be having arguments with yourself. Positivism is a philosophical movement that flourished in the 1920s and 1930s and centered around a group of philosophers that held regular meetings during those years in Vienna. The core idea of positivism is that every single meaningful statement must either be empirically verifiable, that is, it must refer to something that can be observed empirically, or must be some kind of statement of conceptual analysis. So because that seems to be the whole argument here. Every single meaningful statement must be empirically verifiable. It must be observed empirically, or must be some kind of statement of conceptual analysis. By statement of conceptual analysis, I mean any statement involving logical relations between propositions. Any statement that is true by definition. In other words, I'm talking about tautologies. Example, if you know that I'm taller than Eric, Eric is taller than Danny DeVito, then you also know that I'm taller than Danny DeVito. You know, even if you've never met me, Eric or Danny DeVito, you have never been able to observe us and compare our heights. This is because, given the truth of 1, 2, and 3 just follows by logic. The view of the positivists, then, was that any statement which purports to be meaningful must be either a logical tautology or an observation statement. Any statement which was not A nor B, the positivists said, was meaningless. Among these so-called meaningless statements were things like God exists, which is clearly not an observation statement. You can't observe God empirically, and also does not seem to be a tautology, although St. Anselm and Chris Langan would disagree, but never mind that for now. I would also sort of disagree. I would say God exists would be something we could observe by sensing or perceiving the soul of the universe and equating that with God. Saying that the universe exists, to me, is an equivalent statement to God exists. God simply is a reference to the totality. It's a reference to the totality of the universe through the anthropocentric perception, which tends to anthropocentrize everything. So we look at animals and we view them, we look at an electron and we say the electron wants to go near the proton. Well, we say that the universe wants evolution. And so the extent to which we anthropocentrize each other, we view each other as having souls, personalities, whatever, the extent to which we view individuals as existing also implies that God exists. And so in order to, from my perspective, to invalidate the idea of God, you have to invalidate the concept of the individual. You have to say that consciousness is an illusion, and you have to be a full-on materialist and say that nothing really matters. And that brings you to a sort of nihilism in which I think you sort of just get back to the idea of God in a circular way. But let's get back to what Ivan is saying. Ivan is saying, let's continue with what he's saying, some other statements that the positivists would have considered meaningless, mystification, or metaphysics, a term of abuse for them, would be Platonic forms exist and reflect the real essences of things, or Cartesian-style souls exist. You get the idea, I hope. Now, Curt, a question. Are there any statements which are neither A, logical tautologies, nor B, observation statements capable of being empirically shown to be true or false, which you would consider to be admissible in rational public discourse. Based on what you have said and what you excoriate, Platonism, Abrahamic religion, etc., I cannot think of a single statement that would meet this criterion. If there are any statements which are neither A nor B, which you think would pass your test for truthful speech, then please provide me with some examples. However, it seems clear that any statement which is not B would immediately fail your test 3 external correspondence for truthful speech. Therefore, there is no statement which is neither A nor B could possibly pass your test for truth. As the positivists considered such statements to be meaningless and thus inadmissible in rational discourse, and you consider such statements to be untruthful, and thus inadmissible in public discourse and subject to the penalty of law, your view and that of the positivists are actually very similar indeed, except for your view that the public making of such statements should be subject to legal penalty. Your view and that of the positivists on which statements were meaningful and rationally defensible coincide exactly. Moreover, the positivists had one other major idea associated them, usually called the verification criterion of meaning. This idea was a response to the question of how to determine whether some arbitrary statement P was meaningful or not. To determine whether P is meaningful or not, first ask, is P a tautology? If it is, then P is meaningful. If P is not a tautology, ask, is it possible to empirically verify P, that is, to determine whether P is true or false by way of empirical observation. If it is, then P is meaningful. If not, then P is meaningless. For example, the statement, "It is raining outside right now," is meaningful according to positivism because it is possible to look outside and determine through empirical observation whether or not it is raining outside right now. I trust that more examples are unnecessary and that you get the idea. Now, the real technical meaning of the term positivism has been explained to you. You can at last begin to see my criticism for what it actually is. Perhaps you may even be able to deduce my real meaning already, but just in case, there remains more to explain. I will say it once again just to sear it in your brain. Positivism does not mean the statement of positive claims or views. You are right. Terms like positivism, verificationism, and verify do not appear on your website. But I see now that this is not because you don't hold the views that are associated with these terms. It is because you don't know what the technical meaning of these terms are. You are not familiar with the standard philosophical terminology, and so you have invented your own terms to describe views for which standard terms already exist. This is why so many people often complain that they can't understand what the hell you're talking about. Oh my God, that instantly clarifies so much. There is another term, the standard and accepted usage of which requires clarification before we can continue. That term is falsificationism. For now, I must stop. I don't have the time to finish writing out all of my thoughts, but I promise you, Curt, I will finish this as soon as I can. I ask that you please wait until I've completed writing everything that I want to write on this subject before you issue a full response. Though you may answer the direct question I asked you about whether you would consider statements that are neither tautologies nor observation statements permissible in public discourse if you wish to. As I said, there is more that needs to be clarified before we can truly understand each other and before you can see what my criticism of you is truly saying. P.S. Briefly commenting on your summary section. My formal academic background is in pure mathematics. I am a programmer. The real reason for the misunderstanding between us is not at all what you think it is. I have explained some of that reason here. I will explain the rest shortly. So Curt said, well, only programmers can understand what I'm talking about because they work in this operational language, this operational framework. Well, Ivantheheathen happens to be a programmer. So that kind of, again, it seems that Curt is making arguments like, well, if you're a young man who has never constructed an organization that I have, nothing you say has any weight. Well, if you're not a programmer, then you can't ever understand. Well, seems like those are not very good arguments to me. PPS, the postscript. I see that you've basically conceded that my superstitions were right and that your knowledge of philosophy of science post-1940 or even pre-1940 is nil. No offense, man, but it shows. Also, concerning your speculations about my character, level of intelligence, or degree of intellectual honesty, you are acting like a child. This is all the more embarrassing given that you are more than twice my age. Please stop it so we can have a productive conversation. Oh boy, guys, we're going to pause the video, go lie down for 20 minutes, and see if this pounding headache I have is going to go away. Okay, we just took some ginger. Wait a second, I need to grab the water. Okay, we got the water. Gonna go back at it. Alright. Ivan continued, Part 2. Verificationism / falsificationism. Let me begin by explaining the terms falsification and falsificationism as they are generally used in philosophy of science. This is necessary because the ways in which you use these terms, Curt, are not the same as the standard usages. I think it is highly likely that most people who encounter your work are familiar with the standard usages, and so when they see you employing these terms, they assume that you're using them in the standard way, but you are not. As your hapless leaders have no doubt repeatedly discovered, when you apply the standard meanings to terms like these in the context in which you happen to use them, the result is utter nonsense. They do not realize that you're using these terms in a special sense of your own because, and this is an error on Ivan's part, because they do not know what the standard usages are. Again, this is why I have repeatedly urged you to read more. If you did, you would know the difference between the standard usage of terms like falsification and your own usage, and at least try to take some steps to try not to confuse your readers. Hopefully by the end of this you will do so. The difference between your usage of falsification and the standard usage is ever so subtle, but it is there. So, first to an explanation of the standard usage. Falsificationism is a view that falsificationism is a view in the philosophy of science most closely associated with the philosopher Karl Popper. The view was thought up to explain the following phenomenon, or the following problem. When a scientist proposes a theory to explain some phenomenon, that theory makes universal claims of some kind. That is, the theory is usually expressed in terms in the form of a statement like, under condition C, all entities of type A will behave in manner X. For example, the statement that Newtonian mechanics predicts that falling bodies will accelerate toward the center of the Earth at a rate of 9.81 meters per second squared is one such universal statement. In this example, the object of type A is a standard body, the condition C is falling under standard conditions with air resistance abstracted away, and behavior X is acceleration toward the center of the Earth at a rate of 9.81 meters per second squared. Newtonian mechanics predicts that will happen. Other scientific theories make different predictions, but all such predictions can be expressed as universally quantified statements of the same general form that I gave above. The problem that Popper sought to deal with was this: how do we know that such universally quantified statements are true? After all, a statement like all falling bodies under standard conditions accelerate toward the center of the Earth at a rate of 9.81 meters per second squared makes a claim about all such bodies, hence the universally quantified nature of the statement. Since there are an infinite number of such bodies, Popper reasoned, it is not possible for us to confirm such statements to be true by direct observation. To confirm them, we would have to make an infinite number of observations, and this is not possible. However, Popper said, even though it takes an infinite number of observations to confirm or verify such a universally quantified statement, it only takes one contrary observation to disconfirm or falsify it. Since a theory's predictions are made in the form of universally quantified statements, those statements purport to attribute a given behavior to all entities of a given sort under a given set of conditions. Therefore, all that is necessary to do to show a statement of the form under condition C, all entities of type A will behave in manner X, to be false, is to find one case of an entity of type A not behaving in manner X when under condition C. Because of this, Popper said, when scientific theories make predictions in the form of universally quantified statements, we should never regard these statements as proven, verified, or even as true. Rather, we should say that such statements have been proposed as hypotheses, and that all attempts to find the relevant sort of contrary observations have hitherto failed. This means that for Popper, all scientific theories are to be believed only tentatively, not because they are true, but because no one has yet managed to show them to be false. The term falsificationism is standardly used in philosophy to refer to this kind of view, which you probably heard in like your 9th grade biology class or whatever. The concept, scientific theory can never be proven to be true, it can only be proven to be false. Okay. So much for the standard definitions of falsification and falsificationism. Now let's have a look at some of the statements you have challenged me to try and falsify. In particular, let's start with this one. You don't prove your innocence. The prosecution's function is to falsify your innocence. You are innocent until your innocence is falsified. Now, one thing that immediately jumps out is this. Courts, when they issue their rulings, do not make universally quantified statements. That is, courts issue rulings like, quote, this particular man, John Smith, killed this particular woman, Mrs. Jones, in her home on February 16th while wearing a green jacket, end quote. Courts do not usually issue rulings like, quote, all men named John Smith will kill all women named Mrs. Jones on February 16th while they wear green jackets. And he's missing the end quote, but I'll forgive that. That's kind of funny. Popper's original motivation for turning to falsificationism in the standard sense that I explained was he believed an infinite number of observations would be required to confirm a universally quantified statement. But courts deal with particular events, particular cases, and particular allegations of crime. When someone accuses you of a crime or of making untruthful speech or whatever, they're making a particular accusation. When you plead not guilty against this charge in court, you are making a particular claim. Since both of these claims are particular, it is possible, at least in principle, to confirm one or the other of them using only a finite number of observations. This is pretty trivial to see. Example, if you are accused of committing a murder, it is known that the murder happened at a particular time in a particular place. Then if you're able to show that you were not at that time, in that place at the appointed time, this would confirm your innocence. Not every case is as cut and dried as that example, of course, but the point is that because accusations and rulings in court all come as particular statements instead of universally quantified statements, universally quantified ones, it is always possible, at least in principle, to either confirm the accusation or to confirm the defendant's profession of innocence with only a finite number of observations. This works both ways, as I already mentioned. It is always possible, at least in principle, for you to confirm your innocence or equivalently for you to falsify your guilt. Similarly, it is always possible, at least in principle, for your accuser to either falsify your innocence or to confirm your guilt. How you choose to frame these things does not matter. If you choose to frame the court proceeding in such a way as that your innocence has to be taken as a hypothesis proposed to the court while the accuser has the job of falsifying that hypothesis, then if you should happen to be ruled guilty, your innocence will be falsified, while if you should happen to be ruled not guilty, your innocence will be confirmed. Similarly, if you choose to frame the court proceeding in such a way as your guilt is taken to be a hypothesis proposed to the court, which is often how things do happen, even though they say you're proposed to be innocent, the presumption of innocence, you will have the job of falsifying that hypothesis. Then if you should happen to be ruled not guilty, your guilt will be falsified, while if you should happen to be ruled guilty, your guilty will be confirmed. That's where we have this term, proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be guilty. So I brought this up before. The two are mirror images of each other. What allows them to be mirror images of each other is that in court rulings and accusations of crime, universally quantified statements are not declared for evaluation. Particularistic statements are. Every accusation of crime involves a particular crime and a particular person or persons being accused, and every court ruling refers to a particular case. Since all accusations and rulings are particularistic, they can all, at least in principle, either be verified or falsified only with a finite number of observations. So when you insist that someone can only falsify someone's innocence in court, the term falsify is not being used in the same way that the term is used in standard philosophical vocabulary. In standard philosophical vocabulary, the only sort of statements which it is even claimed that we can only conceivably falsify and never verify or confirm are universally quantified statements. Accusations and rulings relating to particular crimes in court cases are not universally quantified statements. You are therefore using words like falsify and falsificationism in your own unique and totally non-standard ways, Curt. So the next question to ask is, what the hell is going on here? Here's what I think is going on. You are well aware of the tradition in Western law of the presumption of innocence. Approving of this tradition, you have decided to rephrase the presumption of innocence principle as your innocence can only be falsified. The problem with this rephrasing is that it introduces some horrific equivocation into your system that naturally confuses the hell out of people. Most people who see you use the word falsify assume that you mean it in the standard philosophical usage, but you do not mean it in the standard philosophical usage. Part 3. 2 questions. Now that I've come to the end of this explanation, I hope things have been clarified between us somewhat. But before I can go into explaining in more detail what my criticism of you means, Curt, I must ask you 2 important questions. I would like you to answer them before I continue. They are, number 1, are there any statements that would be considered meaningless according to the standards of positivism explained in Part 1, but which in your own system could at least in principle be considered truthful? I understand there is a difference between meaningfulness and truth. That is why I include the clause in principle in my question. Example, the statement I am 7 feet tall is false. It would fail your test for truth. However, in principle, it could pass them. That is, the claim that I am 7 feet tall is at least not absurd on its face. It's logically consistent and existentially possible. To determine whether or not it's truthful, you would have to examine me and measure my height. There are some people out there who really are 7 feet tall, and so if I claimed that it was, at least it could be true. Similarly, positivists would regard that statement as meaningful. But take a statement like God exists, or there is an afterlife, or Geist, spirit, unfolds itself through history. Positivists regard such statements as meaningless because they are neither logical tautologies nor observation statements. In your system, could any statement like these even in principle be truthful? If the answer is no, as I suspect it is, then your system rests on metaphysical and epistemological foundations that are effectively identical to those of positivism. Even though you talk about more things than the positivists do, their views are at the core of yours. So basically, Curt Doolittle is Karl Popper. And that means that your system would also be vulnerable in its epistemological and metaphysical foundations to all of the criticisms of positivism. I will expand upon these criticisms later after you answer my questions. Also, I just want to take a break here and say I was going to read some German today. I don't think we're going to have time because I only have like 20 more minutes. But the German language is extremely conducive to philosophy because the German language requires that you wait until the end of the sentence to understand what the verb is, and then you take your whole meaning of what's been said. And that's what all of this jargon that I'm saying, you can only really understand what's being talked about until you get to the end of the sentence or the paragraph even. There are some German sentences that are longer than a page. So, really the German, if you want to learn philosophy, you got to learn the German language, and that's why we might be doing some German on this channel. But probably not in this video because I just don't have time today. Alright, so here's the second part of the third part of the Ivantheheathen response to Curt Doolittle. Okay, Ivan says, if Curts do not evaluate universally quantified statements in their proceedings when they evaluate accusations of crime, and if they do not declare universally quantifiable statements when they issue rulings on cases, then what is your reason for insisting that court proceedings should be thought of as accusers attempting to falsify a defendant's innocence rather than, say, an accuser attempting to confirm a defendant's guilt? If your answer to this question makes reference to the Western legal principle of the presumption of innocence, as I suspect it will, then your view actually collapses into a form of verificationism or positivism, even though you like to call it falsificationism. This is because the presumption of innocence is a normative principle and has nothing to do with the reasons for holding falsificationism in the standard philosophical sense explained above. A court which operated according to the presumption of guilt, in which the accused would have to prove his innocence, might be monstrously unjust, but it would still be intelligible and rationally coherent. Since accusations of crime are always particularistic, it would at least in principle be possible for a defendant to prove his innocence. If the epistemological and philosophical foundations of your view collapse into a form of verificationism / positivism in the sense explained above, even if a kind of mirror image of positivism, then your view, mutatis mutandis, would be vulnerable to all of the criticisms of positivism, which I will go into shortly. That's all for now. It's important that you answer those two questions, Curt, so please do. Once again, I hope that clarifies things. After you answer, I can begin explaining what my criticism of you actually amounts to. So that comment got 6 thumbs up. So at least six people have been reading this far. I don't know how many people are watching this far, but we're at the Curt Doolittle response. He's gonna respond here. Here's how he opens up. Here's Curt Doolittle. Here's what he says. He says, "You don't really understand the debate of the war period, post-war period, any more than our debate in the present, do you? LOL. Period. I realize you are desperately trying to frame this discourse to suit your present knowledge, but let's point out a few things that you're doing besides that framing: the perpetuation of the era, induction, reliance upon antique thought, set operations, idealisms, using conflation, meaning justification versus truth testimony, all of which are archaic and false methods of investigation of anything other than Scripture. 1. When the positivists used the term meaningful, giving us an exceptional demonstration of a failure of grammar, they meant meaningful for what purpose? Induction. What was the difference between Carnap and Company's position and Popper's position? Trying to solve the problem of induction versus Popper's induction does not exist. Not that Taleb isn't beating this dead horse daily. Number 3, what was Popper's alternative to induction? Verisimilitude, or more correctly, market competition. Number 4, what has the scientific field adopted as their method of exploration? Market competition. Number 5, what does a Bayesian network accomplish? Accounting of marginal measurements producing market competition between success and failure, the same as our brains do. Number 6, why can't a formal grammar of science be produced? And why has the formal grammar of logic been a dead end, except for training people to detect error? Because there's no closure, and because induction does not exist, and because the only unclosed vocabulary in grammar is operational language. Number 7, what does an hypothesis theory law consist of? A rule of arbitrary precision used as a search algorithm for opportunities to apply recipes, sequences of operations, forming a market competition between general rule of opportunity, discovery, and application recipe. This is all the mind is capable of, so it is what we do. Number 8, what is the principal innovation of the post-Darwinian era? The abandonment of mathiness and justification and the universal application of market competition between positive language and demonstrated action. We call this dynamic stochastic equilibrium in economics, and various names not limited to fluid dynamics and quantum mechanics in physics. What do we in court determine who is at greater fault? Conduct a market competition between the offense and the defense by reduction of arguments to the sequence of incentives and operations. In a wonderful case of painful irony, you are able to get away with the error because you have failed to define the term meaning in a complete sentence in operational language. He quote, I have a question. Are testable statements meaningful? Okay, I don't think that's a quote because he never said meaningful twice in a row. Meaningful for the purpose of induction. Well, of course, no, because induction guessing only assists us in free association for the purpose of discovering opportunities which must later be subject to falsification, attempts to falsify. And through this continuous competition, we discover more information, recipes for action, and opportunities for discovery, and with that information, more competitions to run between language, search, and operation action. So I continue the Poppertian program of critical rationalism. It's funny that propertarianism sounds like paupertarianism. Oh, we got a hot meme coming there. Okay, let's go back to the quoting. So I continue the Poppertian program of critical rationalism, under which Popper had no empirical evidence, or he would have discovered that decidability in scientific investigation is and can be and is determined by cost-benefit, by expanding where he failed to from physical to... by expanding where he failed. So he's admitting here that he's just expanding from Popper, which is what Ivan the Heathen was saying. So he's confirming what Ivan was saying. By expanding where he failed to, from physical to social to cognitive sciences such as critical naturalism. And I apply this critical naturalism to the field with the greatest scope of testing claims law, because law only comes into account under material disputes and only admits that which is testifiable and searches for incentives whether testifiable or not. The positivist debate was not merely ideal or technical, but was an attempt to further, Frankfurt, or constrain, Vienna, Marxism, theft, and the incentives tell us what the undecidability of their argument failed to, fraud. And this is the purpose of the law. Can we find criteria under which the untestifiable yet asserted to be testifiable is not a cover for a falsehood, fraud, threat, or harm, where true equals testimony, speech that correspondent with reality existence or a possibility shared experience of existence? The positivist debate was a Victorian, if not priestly, discourse in which the means, motive, and opportunity were unstated. Because we have no evidence of yet what would occur under Marxism, socialism, or today's postmodernism to counter the rationalizations of the Marxist Frankfurt School, who were, in all things, attempting to use the ancient tools of Greek Platonism, Socratic skepticism, and Jewish pilpul critique, as had many previous generations of theologians and philosophers, textualists, to conduct a fraud where words were promissory, rational, not testifiable, scientific, and warrantable. So he's equivocating Plato, Socrates, and Pilpul. It is far harder to think in equilibrial terms in all walks of life, in all disciplines in thought, but this is the current model of all phenomenon from math. See Wolfram's New Math of Complex Operations, computer science, operational logic, sentience, cognition to defeat entropy, to discourse, language to defeat entropy, to economics, cooperation to defeat entropy, to biology, life defeating entropy, to chemistry, limited to entropy, to subatomic through macrophysics, producing entropy. And this is why the discipline of philosophy is being unfunded and combined with theological departments, because other than the use of basic logic to train people to detect errors, the program of the 19th to 20th century, by which the philosophers sought to convert their discipline into a science, has been replaced by computer science and what used to be called cognitive science, in order to end the previous generation's failure to adapt to computer science and now failure to adapt to the study of the brain. The purpose of the study of philosophy is largely the study of middle-class rebellion against the ruling class's application of law or theology, and aside from the scientists, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Locke, Smith, Hume, Darwin, Maxwell, Menger, Pareto, etc., are little more than a catalogue of human error and deceit, with the rabbinical Jews, Plato, Socrates, Saul of Tarsus, Augustine, Mohammed, Kant, Marx, and now Derrida et al. The most... Sentence just ends there. Next paragraph. Metaphysics is nothing other than the study of cognitive processes. It is an ancient pseudoscience for the simple reason that Aristotle did the best he could, but knew too little and had no model by which to discuss the operational construction of cognitive phenomenon from the stimulation of the nervous system and the continuous recursive interaction between those stimuli and memory, producing a continuous stream of prediction over which we can have some modicum of control. In particular, given our ability to use language, can calculate using language names of categories to perform comparisons that every other life forms we are aware of are unable to do. However, in all our language, every bit of it, every name of every category of every name, noun, verb, adjective, adverb, consists of nothing more than an n-dimensional network of constant and contingent and inconstant relations between our senses in fascinating and beautiful complexity, the scale of which is only matched by the stars themselves. Wow. Talk about priestly language. The most parsimonious terms we have to describe these networks are models, descriptive operational simulations, networks of large compatible paradigms, current information products, competing incompatible paradigms, new market entries, theories and hypotheses, new market features, norms, presumptions, and intuitions, established markets, and a field of grammars of deflationary. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Of deflationary, to describe, to inflationary, to fictionalisms, and there is every bit of evidence to suggest that we can produce one most parsimonious paradigm in the grammar of constant relations we call operations, and their constant relations to existential reality. So when you say an alternative metaphysics, this means an alternative physical cognitive ability. When you say an alternative ontology, the question is one of competitive parsimony, correspondence, consequence, and incentive. No more sophisms. Science is the universal language of truth, even if there are a host of allegoric grammars for the communication of meaning. The question is, what is the difference in meaning, information, consequence, and incentive between the more testifiable and every other alternative? And for any alternative, what's one's incentive to produce that alternative? It is the cost of reformation of one's networks, or is it the benefit one obtains through the networks to create frauds? Man, I don't know if I can do this. I have 5 minutes left to complete this. I don't understand if I've just been recorded staring at the screen or what's going on anymore, but I'm gonna try to finish this. I've had 9 times my daily vitamin C. Got my vitamin C. I got a little more ginger. We're just pumping stuff into the brain right now, and we're almost at the end. I think we're getting toward the promised land. Ivantheheathen, I think this is his last reply. I think this is the end of the argument. Let's go. Let's start here. 1. Quote, Curt says, when the positivists use the term meaningful, giving us an exceptional demonstration of a failure of grammar, they meant meaningful for what purpose? Induction. End quote. Ivantheheathen responds, this is simply false. The positivists did not draw a line of demarcation between things that were meaningful for purposes of induction and things that were meaningful for other non-inductive purposes. For them, there was only meaningfulness simpliciter. If a statement was A, a tautology, B, an observation statement, or C, reducible to one or the other of A and B, then it was meaningful. If it was not any of these, then it was not meaningful, period. This is obvious if you just think about it for a second. Positivists regarded logical tautologies as meaningful expressions, and logical tautologies are not essentially used in inductive arguments. Since the positivists regarded logical tautologies as meaningful, their views on meaning could not have been confined merely to what was meaningful for purposes of induction. By the way, a statement like moral is immoral, they reduce to I, the one declaring this statement, have extreme feelings of revulsion at the idea of murder. Since they reduce psychological phenomena like the emotion of revulsion purely to brain events, which were at least in principle observable, moral judgments for them, this is not a difficult deduction to make from my description of positivistic views of meaning above. I do not believe that you are not smart enough to be able to make it. The only explanation for that kind of distortion that makes sense is bad faith. You are bringing induction into the discussion of positivism, which I did not do in order to try to muddy the waters. I focused on a discussion of positivistic views of meaning and did not mention induction for a simple reason. Other than some kind of extreme ontologically realist view, which sees inductive inferences as justified by the inherent final causality in nature, there is an extremely broad range of views on the problem of induction which are logically compatible with positivistic beliefs about which expressions are meaningful. Since I know that your view of induction is not that of the ontologically realist kind, the view of induction that you do happen to hold is irrelevant to the first question that I asked you. It has just occurred to me that you might not understand what I mean by ontologically realist. For now, though, I'll take a risk and assume that you do understand what is meant by that term. If I see any direct indication that you don't, I will pause to define it later. Your restatement of my first question as, quote, I have a question. Are untestable statements meaningful for the purpose of induction, unquote, is a shameless travesty of what I actually asked you. You are trying to duck my real question. My real question is logically independent of the problem of induction. As I said above, a statement's being meaningful is a necessary precondition for its being true. Can a statement like colorless green ideas sleep furiously be true? So, if there are no statements which the positivists regard as meaningless, but which you would consider to be at least possibly truthful, then your theory of meaning and epistemology in effect reduces to theirs at its core. Perhaps I should rephrase this in your terms. I claim that there are no statements which the positivists would consider meaningless according to their own theory of meaning, but not the one you've imposed upon them, but which, according to your system, could at least potentially be truthful. Please try to falsify that statement. Or let me phrase this another way. Take one language P, which expresses statements according to the positivist theory of meaning. Take another language C that expresses statements as evaluated by your system. Then take a meta-language M, which can be used to describe statements in both M and P. Specifically, M declares statements in P to either be meaningful or not meaningful according to the positivist theory of meaning. And it also declares statements in C to be either potentially truthful or not according to your system. Now, are there any statements referred to in M which are both meaningless in P and potentially truthful in C? I claim the answer is no. Please try to falsify that statement. Meaning, language, and operationalism. Furthermore, your complaint that the term meaning must be operationally defined is really just a prejudice. It assumes that only those things which have been given operational definitions are meaningful. In other words, you're asserting an operationalist theory of meaning, but such a theory is controversial. It's not self-evident. You actually have to give arguments for why it's true. There are also some serious problems with your demand that meaning be operationally defined. Some include, one, it's circular. You can only say that the term meaning must be operationally defined if you have some idea of what meaning is, an operationalist idea in your case. In other words, you're saying that the term meaning must be operationally defined because only operationally defined terms have meaning. Number two, operationalism, if true, has the absurd consequence that all of our measuring devices are perfect by definition. Such a concept like length is only just that which a measuring device like a meter stick measures. Then there's no concept of length that is independent of that measuring device and according to which the measuring device may be judged. This means that it's by definition impossible to build better measuring devices than the ones we already have. This is ridiculous because scientists refine and improve measuring devices quite often. These are just two problems. There are many others. By the way, Percy Bridgman himself eventually developed serious misgivings about operationalism and basically abandoned it after philosophical critics poked it full of holes. So you have to actually give an argument for why a term like meaning must be operationally defined, especially considering that operational definitions generally don't come anywhere close to exhausting what we mean by meaning. There is some value in creating formalized languages in which to express certain concepts. The endeavor introduces admirable precision that is frequently necessary in order to clarify thought. But at the same time, when taken too far, it eliminates most of the nuances and shades of meaning that actual natural human languages have. In an area like the law, this can obviously be dangerous and annoying, since statutes, I think he means statutes rather than statues, since statutes can be endlessly interpreted and reinterpreted, and malefactors can wreak havoc thereby. But this is just a natural condition of human life because it is an inherent property of all natural languages. I am sympathetic to the idea that the law could probably use at least some degree of formalization. But I also know that if we were to succeed in purely and entirely formalizing and operationalizing the law, we would only end up stripping it of the one thing that gives it true value. It's striving to approximate the ideal of justice. And justice is an inherently difficult thing to define or explain. We think we know it, but we always hit a wall sooner or later when we try to speak of it. That is why arguments have been going on about it for thousands of years and will not end anytime soon. Except for in a few rarefied corners like mathematics, there is no escape from ambiguity or from the difficulties attendant to proper and lucid communication. All natural linguistic definition is based on analogy, and analogy is an inherently fuzzy concept. That means that meaning will always be inherently fuzzy, something that we all intuitively know about but cannot really explain when pushed. We really have no choice but to stoically accept this and move on as best we can. This does not mean that language does not have inherent meaning or that it's wrong to speak of the meaning of a text, but it does mean that we may not just idly sit there imagining that we can abolish the difficulties attendant to all language with a simple wave of the hand. The explanation for all of these difficulties, the reasons for them, and the pointer toward a path whereby we can begin to deal with them can only ultimately come from theology. But that is not something that need be discussed here in detail, since I know you're in no mood to hear it. For those who may be curious where I'm going with this, I will only say the following. God, in a deep way, just as things like justice, language, meaning, etc., and because he is ineffable in his essence and may only be approached imperfectly and indirectly, they are as well. So now the last part, part 2 of Ivantheheathen, on metaphysics. He quotes Curt Doolittle. Metaphysics is nothing other than the study of cognitive processes. It is an ancient pseudoscience for the simple reason that Aristotle did the best he could, but knew too little and had no model. Unquote. Ivan responds, "This itself is a metaphysical statement, Curt. I am genuinely amazed that you're not able to see it. This is impossible. It is impossible by definition for cognitive science to just be the same as metaphysics. Here is why. Suppose that you're studying cognitive science, in particular the area of it that deals with the mechanisms that make us prone to cognitive mistakes and erroneous judgments. Here's a question. How do you know that the theories and the data provided to you by cognitive science are reliable? You understand the theories and data provided by cognitive science by way of your cognitive faculties. There is no other way to understand them. The only way that you can trust what cognitive science has to say about anything is if you already implicitly consider your cognitive faculties to be at least broadly reliable. But this is a metaphysical claim, and it is a claim that cognitive science, by definition, can never corroborate because it is something that they must have already accepted before they can even turn to cognitive science as a legitimate source of knowledge about anything. Metaphysics always precedes all sciences by definition. If you don't think that it does, then you don't know what metaphysics is. Your anxiety and/or revulsion in the face of the natural ambiguities of language is deeply connected to your refusal to take metaphysics seriously, by the way. On Popper, a minor quibble. Popper's view was not really that induction does not exist. It was more that induction is irrelevant to science. Popper accepted Hume's argument that no finite accumulation of inductive evidence could imbue the conclusion of an inductive argument with certainty. Therefore, he decided to flip things on their head. Scientific laws and the predictions that they make are expressed in the form of universally quantified statements. Since only one counterexample is necessary to disprove or falsify such statements, Popper's critical rationalism, in effect, made science into a quasi-deductive enterprise rather than an inductive one. The last point about Popper and induction is an obvious implication of what I said about his views above. The first error you accused me of, that positivists only thought of meaning in reference to induction, was flat out false, and the second alleged misunderstanding about Popper clearly follows from things that I did say. Yet, according to you, I am the one who does not understand the debate. The sheer chutzpah here is extraordinary. Rhetoric. The rest of what you say is not worthy of comment. It's just more rhetoric about how people who disagree with you are really trying to spin out covers for dishonesty and theft. There isn't the slightest reason to take any of it seriously. By the way, it appears that you also ducked my second question from before. I can tell that you do have reasons for adopting the falsificationist approach that you do, but those reasons are all based on extremely controversial metaphysical premises that you are not even sufficiently aware of, that they might be open to question, and that, when you get down to it, is the whole problem here. So that's 2 months ago. And then someone responds, why are you criticizing him but without making constructive proposals of your own? Couldn't similar criticisms be made by any strong-willed leader that they are narcissistic and cult-like, etc.? Yeah, he does seem like a Stefan Molyneux on steroids in a way, without the acting ability, and not quite as handsome, and with a much worse laugh. Unless you believe in an anarchic model where everyone just bumps into each other until some emergent new order appears, the human race needs leaders. It's in our DNA to follow leaders. The Soviet Union fell not merely because people stopped believing in it, but because it became entropic. And then Orville responds, spending time prepping for the end of the world is not only not productive, it creates a fantasy-based culture that glorifies violence and that causes people to lose touch with society. It marginalizes people and prevents them from making connections in the world we actually live in. People who get sucked into this will tend to want society to collapse, so they will stop trying to contribute. They'll give up any influence that they might have over their communities. What should we do? Instead of constructing a law that requires you to gain political sovereignty somehow before you can actually test it, why not construct a law that you can test immediately? Religious law has allowed minority groups all over the world to preserve their culture and ethnicity, even when they lack political influence. It has also helped certain minority groups gain power at a global level. It has been tested, it works, it can work again, there is very little downside to failure, there are huge potential upsides for success. So, yeah, prepping versus minoritarianism. This guy has a dancing... Ivan the Heathen responds to neutron sauce and talks about light bulbs, entities. The truth is, Curt's ideas all derive from some kind of implicit metaphysical background. If that background is faulty, then everything else in his system is faulty too. And if there's even one mistake, that mistake will cascade and snowball, affecting everything in unpredictable ways. I think Curt fundamentally misunderstands how societies work. He imagines that you can just apply some algorithmic and deterministic process to something like the law, and then everything will work fine. He implicitly conceives of a society as a simple linear system like a bridge or a building that operates according to extremely simple and deterministic laws. If that's true, then it becomes trivially obvious that operationalizing the law and reconfiguring it to work algorithmically is the right thing to do. The problem is that's not actually true. Ideas all ultimately fit together, so the kind of deep metaphysical objections that Eric and I are making against Curt are worth making. Yeah, like the way that Ivan talks about morality, like justice, like ineffable justice, like we can't approach justice. And I guess, I don't know, I view justice as a much more approachable topic. Maybe I'm just coming from a more cynical perspective, and on the terms of justice, I don't view justice as like some very godly or divine thing. I actually view justice as quite mundane. In terms of that, I think justice is mostly retributive, or the need for justice comes from a desire to stop retribution or to stop revenge, which is really a pragmatic thing. Quimbley, B. Quimbley has all these retracted comments, and he's converting. B. Quimbley is converting to propertarianism in the comments. So there's just all this stuff going on. This is very old, and I don't want to have to come back to this. I want to do like a one and a done and leave and go back. It's just it's so much stuff. Like, I did the Ivan versus Curt because it was two people making meaty arguments, and when I look through this like 96 long comment thread, there's no meat here. Wow. Wow. Okay. Yeah. I don't I don't know what else we're gonna do here. I don't know how do you end a video that's been going on for. Is this the long? If I put this together, the problem is that the audio is going to be very problematic. I'm gonna put this in my old video pad video editor, and let's see. Ivan the Heathen has another. This is analyzing Curt Doolittle's rhetoric. There's a 7-comment long reply train here, and he talks about Curt Doolittle. And let's see if Curt responds. He talks about how what is going on here? Someone says they're going to delete comments. Block me. Fair enough. I'm sorry to hear you'll be deleting your comments. Leaving YouTube. Okay. Yeah, I think that's all. I don't think Curt responded to this. But that's all that meaty stuff. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? A dialogue between two opposing voices, and you learn a little bit about Karl Popper. That's really all. This is really two separate podcasts in one. Two very different gear shifting in one. It's got to end sometime. So thanks for listening. Bye bye.